Hi, I'm Radical Liberation, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Looks like I have a camera setting problem. I'll fix that. And that intro, which just gets cooler every time, is got one more thing in it this week, which is kind of neat. When I was at Mises Institute with a friend of ours, a mutual friend of all of ours. This spring, Mark Thornton brought us into his office and showed us a print of a painting that hangs in the Louvre. And he explained how he had figured out that this painting, which is sort of considered a classic painting, is of Richard Cantillon, an important economic thinker who we've talked about on this channel and probably talk about him again. So there's a painting with a guy with like a powdered wig and two ladies. One is his wife, one is his daughter, that is now in the intro. Very excited about that. That represents cutting edge research from Mark Thornton at the Mises Institute. So anyway, on to the first big exciting thing today, which is that we have someone joining us, not just now, but I think for a number of shows to come, a recurring guest. And it's someone you know and you've guessed, but I don't think you've guessed this. This is Ryan Turnipseed.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you, Radlib?
And we're not kidding. His name is Ryan Turnipseed, the man you have known as, Turnip. You just kept changing what you put with it, right? Turnip this and turnip that. Did you have one that you used a long time? I can't remember.
The first one I used was Turnip Merchant.
Turnip Merchant, that's right.
Yeah, the one that I've been using recently was Turnip Magnate. I was told I need to upgrade at Christmas time.
Right. His name is in fact Turnipseed, which comes from the German originally. It was translated on the at Ellis Island or something like that, probably. Yeah.
I've got a plaque here. You probably can't see it on the actual live stream. But the original last name was the direct translation into German. Rübsamen directly translates to turnip seed.
Right, direct from German, yeah. Ryan Rübsamen with the umlaut above the U to make it extra cool. Of course, I was briefly tempted to just have him be on the show as Ryan Rübsamen because that would be easier to remember, and then we'd have the cool umlaut. But his name is Ryan Turnipseed, so we're going to stick with real names and real faces.
Yes.
Very, very nicely of Ryan. He has agreed for the sake of the show to go camera on and with his real name. So the great thing about that, Ryan, is how can they dox you when you've already doxed yourself, right? So
of all the things that I was going to go into, I don't think I was necessarily worried about that. All the things I had open to me in the future were all things that I myself employed myself in. So
we'll see.
A big worry, hopefully.
Okay, so I forgot to mention Ryan is from Oklahoma. So we're actually not far from each other. This is quite a switch because my co-host for a year and a half was from Australia, Mad Mercenary. And now I have Ryan, who I could probably drive to his house in, I don't know, half a day.
Yeah,
maybe
8 hours.
A bit more.
Yeah.
8 hours, maybe. Yeah. So we, as we've discussed when previous times when Ryan was on the show, we actually have a little bit of geographical proximity to some of the things we were talking about when we talk about American history. In particular, you were on the show when we were talking about history of American blacks, and so we were able
Yep.
to talk about Tulsa and the
Yes.
what was it called, the Black Wall Street or something,
Yes.
right?
Yes, the Black Wall Street.
Yeah, that area of Tulsa which flourished and then got burned down in a horrible race riot. Anyway, he's like he's right in there. Okay, so
Yep.
anything I need to do? I'll just say briefly, it really helps to support the show. The expenses aren't ending. As you can see, we have some visual issues in the way that I appear. Actually, it doesn't look quite as bad on YouTube as it does for me, but you know, my tie is kind of shimmering. Anyway, these things are going to be fixed with spending money. I need better lighting and to have the green screen thing work right, and probably a streaming machine. So expenses are going to continue for a while as we continue to upgrade the show and get it to the point where we can have multiple guests on and everything runs smoothly. Turns out that producing a broadcast with pro quality broadcast software, which I'm now using, OBS, requires some metal. So I will be purchasing some metal soon. So anyway, a great way to support us then is at Subscribestar. You can see the link in the description, and our regular supporters are particularly treasured because then we can plan on that income and plan to make purchases and stuff for the show. So I hope to earn your support, Ryan and I, today by following up a previous episode, which we did with Tom DiLorenzo on Lincoln. It's called The Lincoln Lie. It's linked in the show description. I wanted to make sure you could easily find your way to sort of part one, because this is most certainly a part two. In fact, Ryan prepared the slides, and I noticed you did just what I was thinking. We're going to segue from the war between the states, which, let's be fair, if I remember correctly, the previous stream, the focus was very much on what led up to the war.
Yep.
And didn't talk that much about what happened during the war itself. Thank you, Anakin Cringewalker. I looked into the void and the void had a bow tie. Good line. Good line. Yeah, so isn't that right? You listened to it, right, Ryan? That we really
Yes, I did.
We were talking about the lead up to the war, which we need to cover because it's so important to understand that, to understand everything we're going to talk about today, sort of why the war really started as opposed to what the lying history books tell us. So you need to understand that, but also the story doesn't start with the official end of the war in 1865. One of the things I kept running into again and again is certain things started in 1863. An important act was passed in 1862. A lot of the things we're talking about, though maybe the effects were in some cases delayed in terms of the major effect of them, the actual law was passed or the policy was put in or whatever before the war was even over. Certain things were in place. So we really have to start with the war between the states itself, our story today, with a little bit of prelude.
Yeah, it's the typical trend of during a war, a state will seize power and then it will not give it back and in fact take it to new extremes that even during the war it wasn't thought it would go to. And we see that throughout this entire time period. Laws get passed 1861, 2, 3, 1868, and they keep going. And we aren't going to cover the very end of them because some of them are still in place today. But they just keep going well into the 1900s and just keep growing in scope.
Okay, only comment, I was just checking the chat to see if there were any sound concerns before we really plunge in to the slides. Volume kind of low. Check, sorry. Okay, let me know if we are sounding quiet in the chat, please. And then one person says a little bit of echo on turnip side. That is a hard one in my experience, Ryan, because earphones tend to be leaky. So what I would suggest is if you can hear me okay, you should just turn your volume down a little. Don't make it hard to hear me, but turn it down enough that it's not coming out of your headphones. I used to have that problem a lot when I would join AA. Okay.
Hopefully that fixed it.
Okay. Sound okay? Okay. He says volume is good now. It was low at the start. All right. I think we're rocking, Ryan. We are going to get into the slides, folks, because I think we have a lot of ground to cover. We are going to... somebody said you could do the Reconstruction for hours and hours and hours, and that is certainly true.
Yep.
This is obviously, as usual with this show, it's a bit of a... it's an overview. It's introducing you to the topic, getting you interested, hopefully teaching you something you didn't know, which makes you more intrigued. But by no means is this a graduate level semester long course in Southern Reconstruction, which I'm sure such things exist. And even then, they probably have to cut material because this is a big story, and it goes longer than the history books usually say. The source material I was using. Oh, I should show that before we get into the slides, because you're not going to see us when we're on the slides. Ryan Dawson recommended this, Southern Reconstruction by Philip Lee, and I found it very useful. I didn't know that much about the Reconstruction, and so this book really helped me. And then you did, what was the course you did where you were drawing notes from? That wasn't a course on Southern Reconstruction. It was just like an American history course.
It was the typical AP United States history course. However, I went way beyond probably what I should have for the scope of the test and essentially made a history book out of my notes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you're able to draw from that. Okay, well, let's go for it. Okay, I might pop back and forth a bit while on the slides. But Southern Reconstruction, the looting of the South. Okay, so first thing to do is, who are these three gentlemen?
Okay, so if you remember from last time, and these are ordered by chronology, the man on the left is Alexander Hamilton, the man in the middle is Henry Clay, and the man on the right is Abraham Lincoln. All of these drew upon the guy that came before him, and Alexander Hamilton drew upon another guy during the Revolutionary War. I think his name was Morris. He basically copied his homework, if you will. They all wanted the same economic plan in the United States. Starting with Alexander Hamilton, he put it to a manifesto, essentially. Called for extremely high tariffs, subsidies for industries, policies to discourage agrarian society and encourage urbanization, massive infrastructure investments in things like road systems and ports, and a national banking system that would have a inflationary policy.
Now, I'm glad, Ryan, that you used the term infrastructure. Back then, when you read the stuff from back then, they tend to talk about internal improvements. That's just the phrase they used. It's great that you used infrastructure because that has a more of a modern ring and reminds us of certain things going on right now. So anyway.
Yes.
So I'm sorry. You mentioned it's the American system, and I think Hamilton dubbed it that, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah. If you put this to a history analysis, this went until about the 1970s. So it was around probably into the lifetimes of some of the people watching today, no matter how young you were. So it was a very impactful policy. Alexander Hamilton himself, though, did not actually pass most of these reforms. He largely failed and was snubbed by Jefferson, Monroe, and various other founding fathers of the time. And here's a fun fact. Most of them vetoed spending bills on road systems because they viewed it as out of the scope of the government. Which seems insane today. Yeah. So he didn't actually accomplish any of that in his lifetime except for the national banks and the and most of the industry subsidies.
And even the national bank didn't last long, right?
Yeah, Jackson famously killed it.
Well, that was the second bank, right?
Yeah,
anyway,
that was the second one. There was a lease in between them. It got renewed. The first one passed by Hamilton. It was a a bureaucratic thing. There wasn't much of substantial difference between the two.
Right.
You get to Henry Clay, who is the leader of the Whig Party in the United States. The Whig Party drew upon its economic policy directly from Alexander Hamilton. And they were very isolationist in foreign policy. So, I mean, you win some and you lose some. They weren't all bad, but they weren't all good either. Henry Clay wanted to expand the American system to include interstate infrastructure, so not just road systems between towns, but like a giant country-wide road system. He wanted to spend money on canals. He wanted to almost ban imports to actually. The idea was to compete in the Industrial Revolution that was going on at the time. We're at about 1850 now. He wanted to spend a great deal of money on northern manufacturing specifically. So it was a very northern policy, and that's why you don't see much Whig support in the South. So this is a phenomenon known as sectionalism. You can, up until about like 1890 or so, you can divide the United States by economic systems into sections. The South was always agrarian. The Northeast and neighboring states were very industrial. And most of the rest of the country was too new to actually have a developed system, but they would either adopt the industrial American system or they would adopt the agrarian Southern system. Henry Clay had a moment of had a miracle, essentially. The Whigs won the presidency under William Henry Harrison. They thought they had control over Congress. They thought they were going to be able to pass their complete American system. William Henry Harrison famously died a month after taking office, and his vice president, Tyler, he completely vetoed everything that the Whigs did, sidelined them, got kicked out of the party, and essentially crushed the dreams of Henry Clay.
Oh, real quick, Ryan, just mentioning I am right now dropping our show on the Lincoln Lie, which went over all this in more depth.
Yes.
But go ahead and finish the capsule summary.
Yep. And then, so that's the overview of Henry Clay. The next one in this, the next generation is Abraham Lincoln. Bankrupted the state of Illinois, trying to bring American system economic policy to it, and didn't even have anything to show for it. Like, all the infrastructure he spent on it was very, like, they didn't actually accomplish anything. They just threw money at it, went bankrupt, and didn't even get roads out of it. He was a major member of the Whig Party. His main issue wasn't slavery, however, it was economic policy and trade policy. Right. Lincoln was an ardent supporter of tariffs, and he was an ardent supporter of subsidies. But he also drew upon Karl Marx because, little known fact, the Whig newspaper at the time, like the party newspaper, the New York Tribune, was actually one of the editors and columnists on it was Karl Marx. He was the European correspondent. And in that time, it's not like he wasn't doing anything. He published some of his most famous works into the newspaper. And we know that every member of the Whig Party read the newspaper and tried to implement it into policy. So, Abraham Lincoln, that's his background. And then I'm going to assume that everyone knows how the Civil War kind of kicks off. So
right, and one more thing that I think, having read about Reconstruction, I think is really worth highlighting. Because, you know, obviously in my marketing of this stream, and I hope we'll be able to prove it to you, I'm seeing a continuity between what Ryan just summarized for you and what we covered in that previous episode with Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, a continuity of that with what happens once, you know, not just the North, right? It's not just any North that wins. It's Lincoln's North that wins.
Yes.
It's the it's the North of Hamilton, Clay, and Lincoln and the Ascendants, their ideas and the Ascendants. That's what wins, right? And that's what I think affects so much of our story. So, with all that in mind, I once again want to highlight that they never tell you what Lincoln did between being in a log cabin reading by candlelight or whatever and becoming president. He wasn't a young man when he became president, I don't think. I don't remember how old, but he wasn't 30, you know.
No, he wasn't.
He'd had an extensive career, and nobody seems to know what it is. He was a lawyer for the railroads. Much more,
and that's another theme that we're going to tackle.
Yes, much more on that to come. Okay, ready for the next slide?
Yes, I am.
All right. So what you're going to talk about here is, obviously, since the North wins, that's the Republican Party. You know, Lincoln's from the Republican Party. It's not just him, right? It's the to some degree, Republicans and Democrats they're not evenly distributed between the North and the South. It would not be right to say that all Republican members of Congress were from the states that stayed in the Union and all Democratic members of Congress were in the left for the Confederacy. That is not true. There were Northern Democrats, for example.
Yes, there were.
Having said that, once the Confederate States left, the Congress, the United States, remaining United States Congress was really heavily Republican at that point. Fair to say, Ryan?
Yes, there were single digits numbers of opposition formally.
Right. And so that's why the story that we're about to go into right now is so critical, because what you get during the war and then coming out of the war is complete domination by the Republican Party. So the factions within the Republican Party, you could say, become the story, right?
Yes.
What's going on with the Democrats for some time is a footnote in history. They just don't matter politically. They have no power, and they won't have power for a long time to come. So go ahead.
Well, they have power, but it is very direct. They have no political power, and we'll get to that later.
Okay.
So jump to like the very foundation of the Republicans just before the Civil War starts. They're already split into two groups. On one side, you have the radicals. These are the people that founded the Republican Party. They're very hardcore abolitionists, very protectionist, very and I should also mention they're abolitionists not just for moral reasons but also for economic. They don't want wage labor competing with slave labor is usually the talking point that they would throw out. Abolitionist, protectionist, and they were also very very sectional. They did not like the South, and they made that known very well.
Okay, I got to jump in with Thaddeus Stevens quote now. Okay, this is the perfect moment. All right, so we're going to mention Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner. Those are the gentlemen pictured. I'm guessing.
Those are the two leaders of the radicals. Yeah,
okay, and it's Stevens on the left.
Yes.
Okay, Stevens on the left. Okay,
I believe so.
So listen to this from Harvard and Columbia historians Samuel Eliot Morrison and Henry Steele Commager. And they say, now this is jumping a little ahead in our story, but I want you to have a profile of this man as we tell this story.
Before you start, it's the guy on the right. I messed up.
Oh, okay. It is. Okay, I was going to say, because listen to this profile. I'm looking at the picture on the right and I'm thinking, that's who they're describing. They're describing that guy.
Yeah.
Okay, so listen.
I messed up, sorry.
Okay, so listen. Here's what they say. They're talking about how he was more interested after the war in punishing white Southerners than in helping the freed slaves and in helping the African Americans. And here's what they write. Stevens is one of the most unpleasant characters in American history. A harsh, somber, sorry, I'm laughing because this is so brutal. let me start again. A harsh, somber, friendless old man with no redeeming spark of magnanimity. He was moved less by sympathy for the Negro than by cold hatred of the Southern gentry. He would humiliate, disfranchise, and despoil all landed property owners in favor of the freedmen. That means he wanted to do that.
Yeah.
Stevens sought retribution, saying, and now the rest of this is just a quote from him, "I have never desired bloody punishments to any great extent, but," remember our rule about when you hear the word but, right?
Yeah.
"But there are punishments quite as appalling and longer remembered than death. They are more advisable because they would reach a greater number, strip a proud nobility of their bloated estates, send them forth to labor and teach their children to enter the workshops or handle a plow, and settle the their states with new men and drive the present rebels as exiles from this country. Now, I love that. I wanted to share that because not only does it give us a profile of the man Thaddeus Stevens, but it shows some themes that are, I would say, Ryan, are of interest to people in our circles. I would say there's a certain egalitarian aspect, or you could, or maybe I should put the other way, anti-aristocratic, anti-hierarchical, right?
Yes, the radicals were all they were all very Quaker-ish. That's not to say that they were a member of the denomination exactly, but they were very they were along those theological lines. Like all of these men were very hardcore. I think only a few of them were like any of the major denominations, Baptist, Lutheran, Catholic, any of that. They were all very like Quaker, Congregationalist, a few things along those lines, like the very radical, even in their theology.
Right, and so what I hear here is that sort of brutal egalitarianism. I will level you down, and
Yep.
I will do it with a vengeance. Right. Anyway, so there's Thaddeus Stevens on the pictured on the right, a little portrait of the man. Go ahead.
All right, so these were the people leading the radicals. I didn't show the leader of the moderates because you all know him. It's Abraham Lincoln. The moderates kind of went to the Republican Party after the Whig Party collapsed, and they did not share the same sentiments that the radicals did. However, they made a majority of it for most of the war. So they invaded a party, kind of moderated it, but they kept these people in there. So they didn't get ousted or anything. They just kind of got conglomerated.
Now, I want to draw a parallel here. When we say moderate and radical, I mean, this is I think very similar to how we use the term left and right now, which goes back to the French Revolution, where the right part of the assembly, the people sitting on the right, they are revolutionaries. You know, they do want to make massive changes, which is what Lincoln did, right? In invading the South and so many other things that we highlighted last time. They're kind of like, you know, the revolution should go this far and no further. And then the ones on the left in the French Revolutionary Assembly were like, hey, the revolution's been great, but, you know, revolution forever. You know, we got to keep pushing,
we need
pushing,
more.
pushing. More. Yeah. So when we say radical and moderate, think about like the French Revolution. Like none of these guys are what you would think of as like conservatives or something.
Yeah, I'll put it this way. They're called moderates because when compared to these guys, literally anyone is going to be moderate if they're normal.
Right.
Like, and that's how they were called radicals before the rest of them were called moderates. So that's kind of like the order of operations here. So during the war, this split continued. However, the radicals only had single digits of supporters in Congress. But they kept opposing Lincoln's policy, stating that it wasn't going far enough. Anytime Lincoln gave a speech about preservation of the Union or unity or anything along those lines, typical rhetoric from the moderates, quote unquote, what you get from these people, you basically just bypass all of the rhetoric and say that they want to burn the South down and everyone in it. It's
right.
That's who we're dealing with here. So they did have, although they didn't control the legislative branch or the executive or the judicial, they ran the Republican Party media, which is a very important tool that will come with later, because if you don't know, throughout the Civil War, any opposition newspaper that wasn't the Republican Party was essentially shut down. And if the Republican Party media is all radicals, then you're going to get people that are indoctrinated into radicalism. So that's what we're dealing with here. That's kind of like the foundation for the story today.
Okay, and then I had a quote from the Southern Reconstruction book I shared that I think highlights the the conflict between these two factions. They're talking about the aftermath, how everyone's handling the assassination of President Lincoln in 1865. And someone at the time says, There was one exception to the general grief too remarkable to be passed over in silence. Among the extreme radicals in Congress, Mr. Lincoln's determined clemency and liberality towards the Southern people had made an impression so unfavorable that they did not, among themselves, conceal their gratification that he was no longer in the way. Which is a very polite 19th century American way of saying they were partying when Lincoln got shot. That's something they don't tell you in the history books, I bet.
Yeah, no, and there are mountains of papers of speeches from these people, and every single one of them is insane. Celebrating the death of someone that was a political enemy. This is one example. That happened multiple times throughout the Civil War.
Right.
Writing these just tirades of insults against Union Army generals that weren't just throwing men into the lines and trying to destroy the South. Or it was things along the lines of just questioning if the South even had people in it, things along those lines. And that's all these people wrote about. And they were doing this before the Civil War started. The very famous story is that Charles Sumner was beaten with a cane in the Capitol building when he was giving a speech because he was so, like people, they had to deal with this guy. So they just beat him.
Okay, moving on. So, right. So now we turn to a little bit of focus on the war itself, which we had, like I said, in our previous episode on the Lincoln Lie, we talked about why the war really started. The high tariffs and all this stuff that they don't tell you about, and Lincoln being a railroad lawyer and all the missing pieces. We didn't focus that much on the war. That's in part because if you want to get it's like World War II, right? They call it the History or Hitler channel, right? If you want to get coverage of blow by blow of these wars, their channel's a lot better than this one to come to. So I don't think that's the place where I want to put my focus as a channel is, really going through war history, military history and stuff like that. But we have a slightly different angle we want to look at here, right, Ryan? And that
yes, we do.
That is the effect of the war, and the effect of the war on the South, and how the invaders behaved as they conquered parts of the South, right? Because that already, before the whole thing is officially over, the tone is starting to be set, even before the war's over, of what's going to happen after the war, right?
Yes, this is correct.
Yeah, so go ahead.
So, most most historians will kind of glance over any destruction that was wrought upon the South with they'll just summarize it, and the South was destroyed, and now it needed to be rebuilt. So, but they will never tell you how much of it was destroyed, what was destroyed, or what was going on. So, we'll start with a point that's pretty famous. General Sherman had his march to the sea, starting in Atlanta, and this is often called one of the first examples of total war in history, because he was living off the land. They were burning down every building or settlement infrastructure that they came across, and they were confiscating food from civilians. They weren't killing them necessarily, they were just starving them. So, this is the kind of army tactics that the South was being subjected to. The South had 297 towns before the Civil War started. The Union occupied 162 of them. 11 towns were completely destroyed, not wiped off the map. The 11 towns that were completely destroyed tended to be capitals of states that the Union captured. Just leveled to the ground, left with rubble and destruction, kind of like what you can see in the slide here. Most villages, so not necessarily towns, not meeting the population cap, most villages had courthouses that they would go to, village, town, county. The Union destroyed 45 of these, and all their legal documents were lost. So, if I'm a yeoman farmer in the South, which was I think 90% of the population, all of my legal documents were just destroyed if that courthouse burnt down. My land deeds are gone. Any settlements are gone. All of this, any trade, purchases, all of it's just destroyed. The Union just completely wiped all of that out, and you don't get that back. Most of the South were farmers, we mentioned. 40% of the South's livestock was killed. This was before you could just import it from across the country or from a different part of the world and resupply that. That's going to take a lot of time to recover. If I'm the family farm that has like one cow, a few chickens, and like a pig or two or something like that, if 40% of your animals get killed, you just basically lost a lot of food for the coming year and a lot of your savings.
Right.
And once again, you're not getting that back. All of that either has to be imported from the north, which is expensive, so the majority of the South can't do that, or you have to wait for the South's economy to recover, essentially, so that you can purchase it like you did for those other animals. And that's going to take decades because you're waiting for the livestock supply to replenish. Here's another one as well. People usually view the South as agrarian, and for whatever reason, mentally you make the connection that means undeveloped. There were farming machines in the South. Like, you had machinery at this point in time. 40% of that was also destroyed, about. We don't have exact numbers on that because, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of documents for these places were just destroyed. So it's anywhere between 1/3 and half of it. 40% seemed to be the agreed upon number that I was coming across. Farming machinery destroyed. Most of these people had to take out loans to get that, like farmers usually do. So now that's destroyed as well. Basically, the Union came in and destroyed the livelihoods of most of the common farmer. The South's infrastructure, railroads, bridges, roadways, repair shops, roll shops, any of the other things, were just completely destroyed by the war, and the rest of it was fell into disrepair due to lack of maintenance during the war or overuse because you're transporting armies across little paths between villages. And then here's the kicker: in frontline states where the fighting was actually occurring, usually the Confederate Army would usually get support from the population because it's their side. So they would usually bring food to them and medical supplies, all the other stuff. They had the home field advantage, if you will. The Union would just confiscate everything, burn down the farms, things so that no one else could use it, and they had their supply lines coming in from the north. So if you lived in Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Tennessee, food prices are skyrocketing, and we'll get to the financial side of that later. The other side of that is that the Union's burning it all. The actual supply of seeds to actually grow these crops was almost wiped out in most of these states, and people were actually starving.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know if I'm using the term quite right, but it sounds rather similar to the scorched earth strategy.
Yes, and that's exactly what it was. It's just the invading army was doing it.
Yeah, it's the invaders doing it. Right. Yeah, so I wanted to share something, again, jumping way ahead, but just so you understand how devastated the South was by all this. It's a devastation that continued, and that's part of the story we'll be telling. But listen to this. Nearly a century after the war, 8 of the 10 states with the lowest per capita income in 1960 were former Confederate states. The classic example is Mississippi, which ranked number 1 in 1860 in per capita wealth, but was dead last at 50th, 50 out of 50, number 50 out of 50 states in 2011 per capita income. So this destruction was so big, and other factors, some of which we'll be learning about today, that it is still felt to this day in these regions.
Yeah, and it wasn't just this. The North did a lot more damage in a lot more indirect ways, as we'll get to in the next slide, actually. If we were done with the destruction slide, Radlib.
Oh, yeah, we're on the South slaughtered. Sorry.
Yes, okay. So let's look at actual people in the South now. So not just their property, livestock, anything along their towns, actual bodies. The South relied on white men specifically to do things. That was their system. A a quarter of the white male population due to the Civil War died. Just, they're gone. They're dead. Most of them were in fields and other hills, battlefields, and they were still being found into the 1870s, over a decade after the war started. So that's just the place that the South was. One out of every four white men that you knew in the South are gone, and you're probably going to come across them in a field sometime in the next decade. So most of the Southerners that died did not receive a proper burial. Most of them were thrown into shallow graves, and this is you can see kind of the standard here. If you look at Gettysburg, it's in the north. The Southerners were all thrown into like 2-3 feet shallow graves with a little bit of dirt thrown over them. The Union gets a very fancy grave and a memorial attached to it.
Now you say here that only a few hundred Confederates received a proper military burial?
Yeah, and most of it was done by
their... Only a few hundred? Wow.
Yeah. And so that was actually that was nearing kind of like the end of the war when they were in home territory. What would happen was you would get people from the town, if they could recognize a corpse that they knew, they would actually give them a proper burial. Throughout the war, usually what would happen with the South, they would bury their own, but they were usually in such a hurry to move because the South didn't have time to just wait around. It was a quick war for them. They didn't have time to bury people, so you just got the standard battlefield cleanup. You don't really get the graveyards like the North gets, because the North's fighting a war of attrition. Whenever the North comes across the Confederates, they throw them in a shallow grave in like a really undignified or unknown spot so that people can't even come after them. When it's finally into the South, where people can actually give these proper burials, it's only if you can recognize the corpse. You're dealing with modern warfare here. That's not very often. So we only know of a few hundred Confederates that actually got a proper burial after dying for their homeland, is what it was. And so the people that fought for the Union got a very nice pension out of it, and I think that you have a graph to show for that, Radlib, that you've tweeted out, was it?
I'm sorry, say that again. What are you asking about?
Did you have a graph of Union military pensions?
Oh, let's come back around to that.
Okay, all right.
You were going to share a few more things about on the South slaughtered, right?
If you fought for the Confederacy, the only support that you got after the war, if you managed to survive, was whatever other people provided for you. They were left out to dry. They got nothing. They got nothing out of it except occupation and destruction of their homeland.
Right, and you were going to mention Arlington, which I think is...
Oh, yeah, sorry, I skipped over that. Yeah, so the main Union cemetery, Arlington, still in use today, that was actually Robert E. Lee's estate. And after it was captured by the Union, it was turned into a graveyard for the Union dead, kind of out of a spite or as a snide gesture or something along those lines. After the war, Robert E. Lee never returned there again. Like, his home's a graveyard and there's nothing he could do about it.
Right.
And meanwhile, his own men are thrown into shallow graves. Yeah.
All right. Inflation and starvation.
Yeah. So, it's not all the North's prowess that won them the war. The South had a very terrible economic policy, which actually does matter during war, believe it or not. So, I'll give you like a summary here. They inflated it out the wazoo. At the start of the war, they basically had it equal to a gold dollar. One Confederate dollar was one gold dollar. You could exchange it for gold. This was when the South was still up and running. The war just started. 2 years later, 1863, it was 3 Confederate dollars for one gold dollar, so 200% inflation in the terms of exchange. At the start of 1864, by March, 26 Confederate dollars bought one gold dollar. And at this point, inflation is so bad and prices are going so high, so 2 separate things there. You get bread riots in Richmond quite famously, and in other parts of the South not as famously, led mostly by women that were left at home, who were actually starving, and most of their children were starving because there was no food. So they led kind of like the the propagandized French Revolution, women marching on the town for bread. There's a lot of propaganda to that in France. It actually happened in the Confederacy and it's quite well documented. So this prompted the Confederate government to re-examine their economic policy, and basically, the simple way I can explain this is they basically held up the Confederate dollar and asked everyone to mark out a few zeros. And okay, the long explanation is that they converted certain bills that they had printed into I guess the best way to describe it would be bond. I'm losing the word right now. They converted them to different notes that would yield interest over time. And basically tried to take them out of circulation, printed new ones, and this stabilized prices. It cut down on the money supply, and the exchange got brought down from $26 to $19 for one gold dollar. Did that all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So 1865, the next year, it was worthless because they had basically lost at this point. The front collapsed. The government was fleeing. No one wanted Confederate currency anymore because it just wasn't worth anything. No one would accept it. No one wanted it. So you have all these people that are starving now. Tradesmen cut off. That was the Union war policy. They aren't farming, as we mentioned earlier. Most farms were destroyed, burnt down. Their equipment was destroyed. So the invading army became kind of like a rationing agency. The Union kind of brought it as a propaganda victory that they were feeding the South, and then covered up the fact that they were the reason that the South was starving in the first place.
Right.
So, and you can find a lot of cartoons of this, funnily enough, if you just go look for Civil War rationing. It was a very common sight to see like army caravans in like the center of a village with two riflemen and a cavalryman by it, just handing out grain to people. It turned into essentially communism by the end of this. Waiting in bread lines, having a centrally managed food supply system. So we know that it's really hard to calculate that. It might even be impossible as per calculation theories. People did end up starving en masse because you've destroyed all the infrastructure. You're rationing now in a centrally controlled supply system. You're not letting them go back to farming. You misallocate resources, they die. It's as simple as that. We don't actually have the actual numbers about how many people died because record keeping wasn't a big priority in 1865 for the South or the North.
Right.
So during all this starvation, though, we know it happens because we have a lot of people that really talk about it. The thing that really stood out to me was in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." It became a very commonplace saying around the table, "Give us this day our daily bread, and a little meat too, O Lord." Because, as we mentioned earlier, the livestock was being slaughtered. Meat became a luxury. The most common food that you were getting were grains, potatoes, and then a few root vegetables. Very few people had meat about 2 years into the war. The South was, I don't know how much more I can emphasize this, starving at the hands of the North. So the Confederates, we also have this documented, resorted to eating small animals, crows, frogs, snakes, rats, and something that we also see correspond with this is that the amount of stray cats and dogs in the cities in the South disappear at this time.
Wow.
And we know that people were actually resorting to eating them. You couldn't import food from Europe or any of the other sympathetic powers because your ports are blockaded and the other powers don't want to actually go help the South. Another shortage was alcohol and tea. Alcohol became non-existent in the South, so moonshining became very popular. And the most common moonshines was that made of corn, grains, sweet potatoes, or rice. And they were described as being absolutely vile. But it's still alcohol. Food shortages were recognized by the Confederate government. They started releasing prisoners from jails because they couldn't feed them. And the grimmest thing that I think that came out of this was there was a phenomenon known as starvation parties, where people would meet up with water, dancing, and music.
Mm.
And they were called starvation parties. That's the
Wow.
state of the South at the end of this.
Wow. Okay, so what to do with the South?
Yeah. So, this is the first major conquest of the United States, because we had the Mexican-American War just before this, but barely anyone lived on the land that we took.
Right, right. It was a
The
real estate
U.S. Army.
it was a real estate acquisition, less than a conquering of a large people.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So the U.S. Army actually has to learn how to occupy territory filled with millions of people that now despise them. They took a very, I'll call it decentralized, because in terms of command structure, that was what it was. Every general that was kind of in the location had the final say on what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But that just turned them into like small dictators. So different generals were put in charge of administering like cities whenever you captured them, different regions if there weren't any cities, things along those lines. New Orleans is a case example of just how petty these generals would get when they were occupying the South. 1862, the North took New Orleans very early on in the war. And believe it or not, the South really did not like these Northerners coming all the way from the opposite side of the country and occupying one of the most southernmost cities.
Mm-hmm.
So, the guy in charge, his name was Benjamin Butler. He got tired of this and he issued an order, and I'll just read it off for you right now. It's a short order, and I can read it verbatim. New Orleans, May 15th, 1862. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies, of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation by the command of Major General Butler. Translation for that: if you're in New Orleans and you're a woman, if you insult the U.S. Army, you're going to get arrested as a prostitute.
Right.
So
and they did it. I mean, this isn't just words.
Yeah, this wasn't. Yeah,
they followed through. Yeah.
So, the Northerners couldn't handle being insulted by women. They arrested them and proceeded on with the war, kind of. So, another thing was that generals, being under the guise of wartime measures and things along those lines, they would confiscate food or valuables or contraband, and we'll describe that soon, from the population of the South to sustain themselves or fund the war effort. So this is basically just a blank check saying that the generals can just do whatever they want to you. At that point, there is no control over them. They are their own little tyrants in the South, in their occupied territory. What is contraband? That's a very vague term, and that's intentional. Contraband ranged from anything from enslaved persons to cotton to jewelry to alcohol to essentially whatever the general considered to be immorally traded. And this was happening before this was deemed legal. Congress heard about it, and they passed an act saying this is perfectly within the bounds of the Constitution. It's called the Confiscation Act.
There was more than one, right?
Yes, there was more than one. This is just the they varied in scope because they kept getting challenged legally because the first act didn't cover certain things. Generals were breaking it. It got dismissed, and then Congress would go and justify it and say, "Hey, we passed this law. It's legal." This is the you're working with the Republicans here in the North, right. So it's typical of them. And then in the South, it's quite outrageous, and it's the army ruling things. It became known as the era of bayonet rule. That's just what they called it, and it's probably the most apt description. The army's got the bayonet, and they're pushing you around with it, and if you don't go along with it, you get stabbed. So that's what happened to the South while it was still occupied before Reconstruction became a formal thing. This is what was happening on the political side.
Okay, so let's move on. The ascension of Andrew Johnson. Okay, so that concludes the coverage of the, well, we'll keep referring back to the war period, but
yes,
that's basically mostly what we wanted to highlight from the period of the war itself. So moving into after the war now.
So, Andrew Johnson was the only Democratic senator to stay with the Union. His home state was Tennessee. He was poor, and I believe the story is he taught himself to read. So, very, very Southern in the way he was kind of brought up.
I think he was the only Southern senator. There were probably Northern Democrats, right? But
oh, sorry, yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry,
yeah,
the only Southerner, not the only Democrat. Sorry.
Right. The only Southern senator. Yeah.
Yes. He was chosen for vice president in Lincoln's second term. Lincoln's first term, his vice president was one of the radical Republicans. He switched that in '64 because he was afraid of losing the election to the Peace Democrats in the North. So there's your Northern Democrats. He switched his vice president to the only Southern Democrat who stayed in the Union, and they rebranded the Republican Party to the National Union Party. Lincoln just saw this as a gesture. He didn't think this would actually change anything, and it would just keep him from losing the election. Not to Lincoln's plans, though. He got shot in 1865, just 1 year into the second term. So now the victorious Union has a Southern Democrat leading the executive branch. Johnson was not popular in the North or in the West, and these were the only places that held political power at this point, legally. Like, these are the only places with senators, representatives, voters, anything along those lines. It's all in the North and the West now. The war's over. South is occupied. This is a major disaster for the Republicans, because now they have to deal with the executive branch being back in the hands of the Southern Democrats. And it's a disaster for Johnson because he can't do anything substantial, and he hates everything that's been going on. The media originally portrayed him as a radical Republican, which they did that. I'm not making it up. It makes as much sense to me as it will to you guys, because he was a Southern Democrat. It's insane to me that they could portray him as a radical Republican. He quickly broke with that image, and he started to basically, he released his own series of speeches that said what he wanted to do with the South after, now that they've occupied them. And then in reaction to that, the radicals in Congress released their own series of speeches and plans for what they wanted to do with the South. And also, before he got shot, Lincoln wrote down his own plans for what he wanted to do with the South. So this is what we're dealing with here. The country is now divided with three forms of construction and what to do with the South. So, in the next slide, we'll see what they are.
Okay, yeah, I think you're about to say this, but I remember reading that Johnson actually felt a certain loyalty to, I mean, maybe not to every detail, but he kind of wanted to carry forward what Lincoln had in mind.
Yes, yeah, and we'll see that here.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Lincoln's plan.
I've switched. Johnson versus the radicals. Go ahead.
Yeah, Lincoln's plan was it was considered moderate. Of course, we know that it's not moderate. He just occupied the South, for God's sakes. He just gets the term moderate because of the other people in his party.
Right.
Lincoln wanted to give amnesty to anyone at all in the South that swore an oath of loyalty to the United States. The only people excluded from that are Confederate generals and their main political leaders, so senators, representatives, cabinet members, presidents, people along those lines. And once 10% of the state population had done that, they would be back in the Union. Nothing had changed. So you notice that you don't get much along the lines of what to do with the actual policy in the South or slaves or anything like that. Really helps underline the point that Lincoln cared about trade more than he cared about slavery in the Union, like this. And you can see that in the plan. That's all he cared about, was getting the Union together so that he can keep with the terrible economic policies that he had governed Illinois with, just on a national scale now. Johnson, he mostly kept this plan. He had Ulysses S. Grant tour the South now that it had been occupied and asked him for his recommendation. So, credit where credit's due. You don't usually now see a government actually put someone out on the ground and say, what should we do? Grant came back and he made his own report, which we'll drop that for now. You can go find it if you want to. It's out there. He kind of conglomerated the two. He was going to pardon anyone that took the oath from Lincoln's plan. However, he was going to pardon those higher officials and generals and plantation owners if they petitioned him personally. So, case-by-case basis, who he was going to let back in. So here he's going even farther than Lincoln in terms of leniency, quote-unquote. In order to be back into the Union, he added the clause that slavery had to be outlawed. And their secession ordinance, their paper saying they were joining the Confederacy, had to also be repealed. So that last one's a technicality, but he added it into the plan anyways.
Right. Now, worth noting that he added that bit about slavery. That was not Lincoln. Lincoln,
yes, correct.
As we highlighted in the show on Lincoln, his focus had to do with collecting tariffs and stuff like that. And when he became president, he said, you know, I want to keep the Union together. If that means keeping slavery, then I'll keep slavery. If that means getting rid of slavery, I'll get rid of slavery. I don't really care. But you better pay the damn tariffs. That was his unmistakable message. And even late in the war, he said, yeah, I don't know if getting rid of slavery, abolition of slavery is going to be required he wants the Union back together. That's his focus.
And it should also be noted that Johnson's plan, that part also came from Grant's recommendation, if I'm not mistaken, because remember, Johnson is the Southern Democrat here. He's not some ardent abolitionist. So, both of these plans absolutely angered the radicals because the radicals viewed themselves as a conquering force of God who just took over these evil secessionists, and now they want to occupy them. And neither of these plans really occupy the South. So, if you remember back to the beginning of this, or I say the beginning, semi-beginning of the show, we were talking about Sumner and Stevens. They kind of gave rhetoric about what they wanted to do with the South. They didn't give a manifesto necessarily, but spoilers, we'll see what they did with the South because they ended up winning out. They gave a bunch of speeches opposed to anything that came out of Johnson's mouth, saying that they wanted to punish the South. They wanted to confiscate any wealth that was gained by slavery. That was in a speech. Didn't end up coming to fruition, but that's how far they were willing to go. They wanted to force civil rights upon the South more than what was in the North at the time. And they wanted to bar any Confederate sympathizers from political workings. I'll translate that for you. That they wanted to bar the South, anyone that sided with the South, any Southern Democrat from ever voting again or being in the political process, and just have the Republicans administrate the South. So Johnson, I mentioned earlier, wasn't really popular in the North. He wasn't stupid, however. He tied himself to Ulysses S. Grant to try to stay afloat and not get kicked out immediately. This didn't work because Grant will later betray him. So with this time that he's bought himself, he's not actually going to push for policy, but instead he's just going to veto any and all legislation that comes from the Republicans in Congress. That's what we're looking at here now that the glorious Union has won.
I wanted to go back to the Radical Republican plan where, as you highlighted, what it amounted to is, we will occupy you and we will run your states now and so forth. So I think from where we are today, the United States is so centralized. We are in the post-Lincoln, post-Teddy Roosevelt, post-FDR era,
Yep.
It's hard to understand how shocking this was. There was still a very strong notion of the states being governing of more of a decentralized, federalist design, right? That's what everybody had in their minds, despite the war between the states. I was reading that people found this very, very shocking. It's like, so you're just going to centrally control all these states?
Yeah.
What, forever? I mean, they were like, this is not America anymore if you're going to do it that way. So it was really considered quite shocking at the time. It's a little hard for people now to be as shocked because we're just so used to the center having so much power. But at that time, prior to the war between the states, the federal government just wasn't very big, and it wasn't part of anyone's life. So the idea that it was going to run half the country, or however much the country it was, some huge chunk of the country, basically, was a real change, shall we say?
Yes, it was. So
okay, so shall I do a dramatic reading of Charles Sumner here?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Well, set it up though.
Are you?
I'm talking about the quote. The quote that you have in the notes. Yeah.
All right.
That's right. That's right.
I mentioned the radicals, led by Sumner, very deeply religious people, viewed the Civil War as kind of like a crusade or an act of God.
So this is the what's this? The horrible song, the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah, essentially, right. Like that is
basically
their,
we're trampling them out like the grapes for Jesus or something. I mean, it's really it's a horrible heretical song that I've even heard sung in my own church, which I objected to. But anyway, sorry, go on.
And they essentially viewed themselves as like Roman conquerors over these rebellious provinces, and they were really, really annoyed that a Southern Democrat, annoyed isn't the right word, infuriated, and sometimes they would scream during their speeches. This is who you're dealing with, and you can see this in their rhetoric. We have an excerpt here for one of the speeches of Charles Sumner about essentially the state of the country after the war.
Right, and it's in opposition to President Johnson. This is one of the last great battles with slavery. Driven from the legislative chambers, driven from the field of war, this monstrous power has found a refuge in the executive mansion, where, in utter disregard of the Constitution and laws, it seeks to exercise its ancient, far-reaching sway. All this is very plain. Nobody can question it. Andrew Johnson is the impersonation of the tyrannical slave power. In him, it lives again. What a nut.
Yeah, there's a reason that guy was beat with a cane on the floor of the Senate. Everyone thought he was a nut. We aren't the only ones here today that think this.
Right. Okay, let's wrap this up and keep rolling. Other comments you wanted to share from this?
Nope, I'm ready to keep going.
Okay. All right. So then, U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands.
Yes, this is the Freedmen's Bureau, but as you can tell by the name, it was beyond just freedmen, kind of. So, what we have here is kind of like a glimpse of what of what Congress wanted to do in regards to reconstructing the South before they passed the actual acts themselves. So this is considered the first federal welfare agency, believe it or not. And what it was meant to do was provide food for anyone that was starving in the South. Spoiler, it didn't actually do that well, and by the time they actually started to get their stuff together, the South was mostly recovered from starvation and just kind of on a general poverty and misery. Freedmen got a lot of support about this, and we'll get there in a second. Abandoned lands is a euphemism. It's a very classical rhetorical euphemism.
Got it.
What this was is this was Congress redistributing plantations that they had conquered to usually most of their friends, Carpetbag, or we'll get to that actually. Most of their friends immigrating to the South from the North, and their allies in the South. So the Freedmen, what did they get out of this? They got a lot of hospitals and rations. They got a lot of farming equipment. They got a lot of courts out of this, a lot of like civil procedural assistance from the Bureau. All of this was paid for, both in part by the federal government and by whatever the army had confiscated. So this is wealth redistribution and land redistribution at the hands of the federal government in the South. It largely failed at redistributing land, though, even though it was a very profitable and I don't know how you, but very profitable and corrupt thing that they were doing, giving their buddies land that they just conquered in the South. The executive branch kind of vetoed this and brought it to the attention of Congress, and it didn't have support in Congress either. So they actually reassigned the lands that they had redistributed, and the Bureau resulted to organizing sharecropping arrangements, which we went over in a previous stream. And this Bureau became so unpopular that it was terminated in the middle of Reconstruction, or at the end of Reconstruction, sorry. So this is kind of like the start of, this is what the Union has in store for the occupied South.
Yeah, so 1872, you said, is when it comes to an end. So
Yes.
That's just 7 years after the official end of the war. So it
Right.
didn't last long. Nobody loved it, including I think the Freedmen. They did not.
No, the Freedmen hated it. Yeah, they essentially what it was is you just got let into the wider society now for the first time in your life. Like you have two types of them. You have what I just described, or you have I just got kicked out of my family, essentially out of my plantation. What do I do now?
Mm-hmm.
And then the federal government says, "Come here. We're the only ones you can go to," and they just assign them a job and give them food and send them on their way. Like, that sounds really, really nice of them, but when you're just kind of out there and you don't really know what you're doing, when someone tells you, all right, you're working this job now, this is your only option, how happy are you going to be at that?
Right, and we'll talk more about what it was like for the Freedmen
Right.
as we go. But let's keep rolling. Acts of Reconstruction and forcing civil rights.
Yeah, so all of this, all the things we've described right now is just kind of a taste of what we're about to get into. These small acts that were going on were very unpopular in the South, and what you had were riots in most of the state capitals against Union occupying armies and the administration that has been set up so that they can take troops out of there and just put bureaucrats in. So what happens is this really increases support in the North for the radicals, because I told you earlier the radicals owned the media and they imprisoned their opposition. So these riots were construed as our policy towards the South is too weak. Johnson is too weak. We need a strong hand in the South to really tell them what we need to do. Or make them do what we need to do. This happens right before the midterms, and the moderate Republicans, like Lincoln's allies and Johnson's allies, completely lose. They lose both the House and the Senate, and since it's just the midterms, Johnson still has his office, but now he can do even less than he was already doing. So now the radicals essentially control the government. Everything but the executive branch, and now the Supreme Court is... The Supreme Court, it would take hours to explain it. The summary version of it is that they had a few cases and ruled all of it constitutional, everything that was going on up until this point. So the Supreme Court's out of the picture. It's just radicals in Congress versus Johnson and the presidency. Johnson can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So the radicals won over parts of the North that they didn't have, that they lost to the Peace Democrats and the moderates, because they really hammed up their support for tariffs, import restrictions, subsidies, national banks, and infrastructure investments. Does that sound familiar, Radlib?
Right. So they lean into the American system agenda of Hamilton, Clay, and Lincoln.
And since the people that system was supporting, the corporate welfare that it was giving out, they're the only people that can vote now.
Right.
The South were the only people voting against that. The South can't vote anymore. So the radicals win in landslides across the board. So now, where you might have thought Johnson might have been trying to lead Reconstruction and receiving backlash, now the radicals are leading Reconstruction. It's their playground now.
Right, and I think it's worth noting before we continue, what we're saying right now was not a secret at the time. Everybody knew, North and South, that it was the Radicals' party now. And all credit and blame would go to the Radicals at this point, which we'll see later, I think. Yeah.
And yeah, it'll become more pronounced as the story progresses. So, the Radicals passed the Reconstruction Acts, and what matters, the other two Reconstruction plans out the window. They're gone. The Radicals want each state to form a government that is to their liking. So basically, what they do is they send a general out to these occupied locations, and until the general says this government is okay, they don't get let back into the Union. Until that happens, the army governs the state, and then that's delegated. So you have different people in the army governing like villages, towns, provinces, things along those lines. Also, in order to get readmitted into the Union, these occupied states have to approve the 14th Amendment. Otherwise, they don't get let back in. And for reference, the 14th Amendment was not even accepted in most states in the North at this point. It had opposition in places like New Jersey, Oregon. It had opposition in there's a Midwest state that I can't quite remember which one. It might have been Ohio. Like, the 14th Amendment was seen as this radical policy giving citizenship to just any person born in the United States.
See, I didn't know when what the origin of birthright citizenship was. It's the 14th Amendment.
This is it. Yeah, and it's not even passed yet. And to get back into the Union, the South has to approve it so that they can pass it constitutionally.
So all the anchor baby stuff and all that, it all goes back to this.
Yeah, the Radicals. You can blame the Radicals for this. And each state's new government also had to have universal male suffrage. This is once again something that didn't even exist in some states left in the Union. So the Radicals are forcing the South to adopt policies that are too radical for the North. This is what we're looking at here. Johnson, being the only measure of opposition left in the government, vetoed all of these measures, and then Congress overrode the veto.
Right, because they had that much dominance in Congress.
Yeah, they had the supermajority in every house, essentially. Now, where they used to be the single-digit opposition party, the Radicals now have so many people that there's single digits of people opposing them. That's how big of a flip this was.
Wow.
So, if you go to the next slide, unless you have something else to add, we can get into the specifics.
The occupation of the South. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as you can see by that, the Radicals divided the South into military districts or the provinces. They're conquerors now. They divided them into provinces. Each of these districts had a general that was governing them and administrating them. The only people that could remove or replace these generals were Congress. So the Radicals. Johnson can't do anything to this. And the only person that can install the president can recommend generals to Congress, but Congress can then just appoint whoever they want to. So the South is
I'm sorry,
under the rule.
These different colors you're saying are representing the different regions. So one general is over both North and South Carolina, etc.
Yep.
Yeah.
One general over Virginia. Yeah. So
right.
Most large cities, so think New Orleans, Richmond, Charleston, they had about 1,000 or more Northern soldiers, usually, occupying them and making sure that order was kept. And smaller towns, and when I say this, I'm not saying it as some fringe point or anything. It's just what the Union policy was. Any blacks that they had led into the military during the Civil War were usually sent to occupy smaller southern villages so that the North didn't have to administrate the entire southern rural landmass. So, just the way that the South was, this is deeply unpopular, and it's going to cause a backlash that we're going to see later. Like, this is about the worst thing that the North could have done in terms of stability and trying to keep the South pacified. Throughout this time frame,
creating a harmonious situation among the communities in the South.
Yes.
Right. A lot of, you could say, impolitic moves were made that were kind of grandstand type of moves, or just spiteful in the spirit of
spite is the
in the spirit of Thaddeus Stevens, right? That spiteful spirit you heard. They're not being politically smart. They're not thinking, okay, now 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what's going to be the impact of the decisions we're making now? They're just like, it's like an elephant in a china shop, right? They are doing quasi-centralized social engineering, and they're doing a hash of it. And the consequences are long lasting.
Yeah, the driving question of the radicals isn't how do we administer the country, it's how can we punish the South.
Right.
And this is what you see with these actions. So these generals continued their wartime policies of censoring newspapers and dissent. And usually what that meant was just imprisoning people, and newspaper owners usually that were critical of them. If you remember the New Orleans quote earlier, this is along the same vein. So
yeah, I don't know if we'd emphasize enough, even in the Lincoln episode, because I was trying to focus more on the lead up to the war. But I don't remember how much we emphasized just how far Lincoln went in acting in an autocratic way during the war. I mean, if somebody opposed him politically, he might just throw them in jail. I mean, there was no the legal niceties were completely out the window. And I'm not just talking about how the South was treated. I'm talking about in the states that were still in the Union. Lincoln ran them like a dictator, In fact, he's called a dictator, and some people who are pro-Lincoln, particularly like neocons, praise that aspect of Lincoln. They're like, he showed how to really use power, and we need another Lincoln is what they want, and what they mean by that is we want that dictator. We want that guy who's going to just blow past all the laws and liberties and constitutional niceties and just get things done, right?
I hate that phrase, but yeah,
I know.
If we're looking at actual actions, Lincoln is probably he's probably the founder of policy for the modern conservative movement, the U.S. Like he does everything that the modern neoconservatives claim to want to do.
Sorry, not the conservatives, but the neocons.
Yeah, the neoconservatives
who are not conservatives.
Correct.
In any definition I could think of, they are not conservatives. But anyway, go ahead.
There might be like a few people here who still have naivety about the way that the U.S. government works, saying, "Well, this seems unconstitutional." Well, duh, of course it is. Yeah. And we're going to get to that because the radicals are they're foreshadowing is what it is, and we'll get to that.
Okay. So, all right. So now fortifying elections.
Yeah.
We're so lucky to live in our time, Ryan, where we have a new way to talk about this. Okay, so here you're not talking about yet a presidential election. You're talking about the elections on the state level in the occupied states, right?
Yes, state level. I think there might have been a couple that made it to the midterms, but I think that might be the next election. So let's not take that. So yeah, this is local governments actually forming the new constitutions, and this is what these policies are going to carry over into the next elections. So not the last one we just talked about, but the rest of the presidential elections that we were talking about are subject to what we're about to reveal to you. Thankfully, modern political climates have given me a perfect way to describe how the Union treated these governments. So, in the first few elections in the South, ex-Confederates, anyone that was in the Confederate administration, the Confederate Army, sympathizers in some areas, were just barred from voting or holding office or anything along those lines. They're out of the picture. military governors also suppressed any Confederate sympathetic votes. So you can't directly do this, but oh no, we didn't go to these rural towns to get their vote, but the election's over, so that's the vote. Like, just dropped like the entire countryside from voting. So who's left? Well, the Freedmen were a large political bloc, and that's because the occupying army went through great lengths to make sure that they voted, and oftentimes, or for they would vote like 99% Republican. It's an army heading the elections, and the army is filled with radicals and Republicans. If this was the other side, the historical narrative would be the army intimidated them. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't hold true right now. So the Freedmen were pushed to vote. They voted almost completely Republican. And the only names that appeared on the tickets were moderate or radical Republicans. No Democrats, no Unionists, no one else, no independents, just the Republicans. That's your choice. Right. So, as we covered earlier, most military governors were appointed by radicals, and they themselves were radicals. This easily just calls into question these new elections during Reconstruction. Like, at this point, if you think these are legitimate elections, I don't know what to tell you. So, here's the system being very obviously subverted, if you will, 100 something years ago. It's not new.
Right. Yep.
So that's what we're working with here, and that's just the state of things. This is in our history. If the government doesn't like the election, they'll do things to change it so that they get the correct outcome.
Right, and I think I forget if you mentioned it before, but with this with the radicals in charge of ending military occupation, sometimes they would just frankly say, until everything is set up in that state so that not only will Republicans win elections, but radical Republicans will win elections.
Yeah.
Then we're going to keep them under military occupation. Basically we're gonna keep an iron grip on this until we can completely turn it to our favor politically.
Yeah, and they're all. It's not just we're going to continue military occupation. These people are staying in power until this ends. Like, the army is here to stay. The radicals are here to stay as well, and it's not going to end until a very surprise upheaval ends it, and we'll get to that in the end of this.
I mean, all I'm saying is, this year could be worse in the United States. We could actually have. The states that voted for Trump in 2020 occupied and under martial law until it's clear that they will only vote for the Democratic Party from now on or something, right?
Yeah, and that's literally, they're being open about this as well. This isn't like some reading in between the lines or some conspiracy.
No, they're just saying
just what they directly said. Yeah.
Right.
So,
okay, next slide. Punishing the South.
Yeah. So, Radlib, you read these quotes better than I do, and I think you're getting a feel for this guy.
Thaddeus Stevens again. These slave owners, these rebels, have led the South into the Civil War. They're responsible for the terrible destruction and loss of life. Take away their land, then you will really destroy the planter class, which has been the cause of so much trouble. Now, one objection right away to what Stevens is saying there is that's not what caused the war, in my view, as we presented with Tom DiLorenzo. What caused the war is that Lincoln wanted his damn taxes and tariffs. That's what caused the war, and that's what Lincoln said was the point himself. That's basically like paraphrasing Lincoln to say that. This isn't some like view I made up. This is what Lincoln himself says. He says, "I don't care about slavery. I care about tariffs. I care about my economic system." So blaming it on the planters, I'm not saying there's no blame. There's always, things aren't ever black and white, right? But
right.
But this is like the German war guild after World War I, right?
That's exactly what it is.
This complicated thing happens, and now you've all got to say that it was 110% Germany's fault, or you're bad or something, and that's not how reality is, right? So this view of
Yeah.
Stevens, well, it's just the planters, and we've got to absolutely turn them into serfs, or we won't have peace. Basically, is what he's saying, right?
Yes, that is what he's saying, and that's a
Yeah,
that's a very good point, because this is where we get the modern historical narrative from.
yeah,
Straight from the radicals themselves. They are the only ones that view the slave owners and slavery as being the main cause of the Civil War at this point. The Southerners view it as the North putting them in an electoral corner and passing all the legislation they want, usually about tariffs and trade.
mm-hmm.
The moderates wanted their taxes and tariffs. The radicals are the only group that are saying, yeah, slavery is the cause of this. And they have such a stranglehold over the media, the government, the occupation of the South, that this is what carries over to today, right or wrong.
So their story becomes the story.
Yes.
And worth pointing out that, prior to that post-war election, they were a minority.
Yep.
They were not the ones calling the shots as far as starting the war or anything like that. They didn't have that much influence. So that their story became the story, in a sense, seems kind of random. It's like, these people who had 7% of the Congress decide what all Americans forever think about what happened back then. It's crazy. Anyway.
So that's just a scale that we're working with here. These are like the historical villains, if you will.
Right. So I can say this next part: acts of Reconstruction, which we mentioned. They forced the South to accept any civil rights measures from Congress if occupation was going to end. And as you keep pointing out, these were not like spreading to the South the benefits of the freedoms of the North. No, the northern states didn't have these measures. In particular, their policies towards blacks were they were not treated equally in the North by any means. And I think this is another one of those cases, just speaking from what I absorbed in school, another one of these cases where they don't necessarily outright just say something that's not true, but they just kind of leave certain things out and emphasize other things. So you kind of leave it with the impression that, blacks and whites were all happy and getting along and equal up in the North, and the South was just holding out, Everybody else was good, and the South was just stuck in the past or something, and they just needed to be brought around, and the policies in the South just needed to be harmonized to what was in the North. Well, that's just not the case at all. And one of the things we emphasize when talking about Lincoln is that not only did he not push for those kinds of equal rights between blacks and whites, he explicitly disavowed such a policy. He was totally opposed to that. By today's terminology, and I know this term gets overused and used in ways that don't make sense or whatever, but in today's terminology, Lincoln was a white supremacist. Very clearly. I mean, read his words, and it's absolutely clear. He didn't use the exact word. Well, I think he might have even said something like, "I believe that whites should be in the superior position." I don't know how much more you could clear you could be,
Right.
So yeah. So what they're pushing on the South here is not, hey, now we're, you guys are going to have to go with our ways now, and we're all going to have equal rights now. No. You guys are going to have policies that we don't even want. Right?
Yes.
So other thing to emphasize is that Reconstruction, as I was mentioning, started before the official end of the war in 1865 because, of course, the North was occupying, like you said, New Orleans as early as 1862. In certain cases, the North had occupied Confederate territories. And so they already were in the position, that post-war position, you usually, as you usually think about it, of having to figure out how to govern, right, in these areas. So the first Reconstruction Act is December 8th, 1863. So that's what, a full year and a half or so before
the war ends.
Before the war ends. So they're already putting these things in place. Let's see. Yeah, and then so who ends up ruling in the South, right? They take away the vote from essentially, I mean, I guess not all of them, but pretty much all the Confederate white people,
Yep.
And so who actually ends up, politically dominant and putting their people into the state legislatures and stuff like that? Well, it's four groups.
Yep.
The carpetbaggers, and that refers to Northerners who come down to the South and very quickly are widely viewed. I mean, this isn't just like some weird point of view or something. They're widely viewed by everyone in pretty quick time as, opportunistic plunderers, who are not coming because they want to see things go well for the South or something like that. They're coming to line their pockets, and boy, do they, which we'll talk about. And then you have Southerners who declare that they were loyal all along, and the Southerners
Yeah.
end up calling them, the other Southerners end up calling them scalawags, which
Yep.
I think the sound of the name, you get the idea. It's not a compliment. And then, of course, there's the soldiers. Before the states are let back into the Union, they're under military rule, so the soldiers are part of the political equation. And then the freedmen. So,
Yep.
in some cases, those are blacks who were free prior to the war, because there were free blacks in the South. But by and large, of course, these are ex-slaves. And then, yeah, go ahead. Anything else you want to add about
Yes.
these four members of the coalition: the freedmen, the scalawags, the carpetbaggers, and the military, the Union military?
So I actually found this, and it's lost most historical credibility, but it actually got it spot on here. History.com, I think, has the best definition of carpetbaggers. They were usually teachers, merchants, journalists, employees of federal bureaus, or former Union soldiers who sought to buy out the now cheap Southern land and quote unquote reform the Southern system. So those are the occupations of the carpetbaggers that you're dealing with. They aren't respectable Northern farmers or industrialists or laborers or anything along those lines. They're the middle class that kind of sat back during the Civil War, or were on the front lines, one or the other, either completely dealing all the damage or just sitting back and letting everyone else do the work. And now they're coming in, buying the land that's been burnt to the ground for dirt prices, and they're going to change the South's political system along the way. And the scalawags, the original use of the word was for farm animals that had little value. So like runts, starved farm animals, rabid, they were all scalawags. Times have changed, but even if you went back, I don't know, 70 or so years ago, these were still great insults. So this like these are the insults of the South at this point.
Okay.
Some places they still are, but not anymore.
All right. So continuing then with the American system and Reconstruction. Okay. Now, I was gonna try to look for an opportunity to not have the slides up all the time so people can see our faces occasionally. This might be the one to do it because we have a lot to say, but I'll do that in a minute. Get us started. This is sort of the heart of why we came here from the point of view of the show, I think, right?
Yes. So the economic system that the radicals and the protectionist Northerners wanted, like all the things that we were telling you before in the background slide and all the Hamiltonian policies, imagine that but put onto steroids. This is what happens now. So Congress and I'm going to list these off and we'll go through them. They passed an act called the Moral Land Grant Act, which is for universities and distributing land. They make a new national banking system. They implement a new currency called greenbacks, which are fiat, not even backed by gold, and completely under jurisdiction of Congress. They implement exorbitant subsidies for railroads, and they fund even more canals, roads, and now telegraphs. So that's the overview of what we're dealing with, and we can probably go into more detail now, Radlib, if you want to.
Right. So in my marketing for this stream, Ryan, I said that the point of the war, what did I say? I don't think I used quite the right term, but the aim of the war was plunder. And so, surprise, surprise, there was a lot of plundering when they won, right? And what I meant by the aim of the war was plunder was not that Lincoln started the war to come down and steal all this stuff from the South. It's that the goal, the whole point of the war, from Lincoln's point of view, was to use tariffs and so on and so forth to continue the plundering of the South, which had already been happening. That's why, in part, the South left. They were getting plundered, and
Right.
and Lincoln was now going to dial it up, and they're like, well, this deal is no longer working for us. We're out of here, and so that's what I meant.
Right.
When I talked about when I said that this is really a continuation of what the whole point of the war was in the first place. It's in sympathy with it, right?
Yes.
And so probably to some degree, and I'd have to check on this, but I bet because they were able to be, the radicals were just in complete control in the South. They were able to push through policies that they might not have even been getting away with in parts of the North, in the South.
Yes. Yes, because it's just an army administration. You don't have to vote on it. You just tell the general, "We're doing this now. Go do it."
Right. Exactly. So, let's start with a favorite topic, as I already gave foreshadowing on, the railroads. Okay.
Yes.
I just don't know how to. You can't overemphasize the railroad situation here. The amount of money that is involved with railroad construction, the amount of corruption, the amount of scandals, it's like Watergate times a million. I mean, it's just phenomenal, the amount of corruption that roils around this. And as I emphasized, Lincoln himself was a highly well-paid, highly paid lawyer, like on a scale it's hard to express, for the railroads. So he was coming out of this, shall we say, railroad government relationship, right? So what happened? They would grant land to the railroads. That was one of the ways that they subsidized them. Subsidies. That was actually illegal in one state constitution. I don't remember which one, but otherwise the southern states, under the control of the occupation forces, basically, were just handing out land like crazy to the railroads.
The state that was illegal in was Massachusetts.
No. There was a southern state.
Oh, really?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's in the book. There was
Right,
one southern state that had it in its constitution that you couldn't do subsidies like that, and so they were never able to do it because I guess they couldn't literally just rewrite the state constitution easily. So some quotes from the book Southern Reconstruction to paint the picture here. The railroads alone represented a greater investment and concentration of power than had ever the slave interest. Someone challenged me when I put the show out there on Twitter, Ryan. Ryan, last I knew, is not on Twitter, so he misses the fun. Or the pain. Someone challenged me and said, well, if you're not going to talk about the slave power, then I'm not going to listen to you, Well, what about the railroad power? If I'd been quicker on my feet, I would have shot that back. I'll tell you about the slave power. You tell me about the railroad power. Because in my mind, that is possibly a bigger part of the story when you consider that Lincoln himself is coming straight out of the railroad power, right? So when the war ends, they go crazy with railroad construction. Very wasteful railroad construction. So, a few more details. When the war ended, the country had 35,000 miles of track. By 1900, the total was 192,000. So let me say that again. From 1865 to 1900, so that's 35 years, went from 35,000 miles to 192,000 miles of track. So just a whirlwind, a blizzard of railroad construction. And by the way, this 1865 to 1900, I don't know that we're going to get into it today. It includes a crash where a bunch of railroad companies went out of business and they just stopped certain projects. Even with that, even with a big bust in railroad construction, they still built just incredible amounts of track. So much so that by 1900, America's tracks accounted for about 40% of the world's total mileage of railroad track. Now, when you think about the fact that there were railroads in India, all over Europe, right? In Russia by 1900, right? Still,
Yes.
America had 40% of the track of the whole world. So it was just nuts. As one person put it in the book back then, the railroads were overbuilt, to put it mildly, right?
So, and being as this is done by a state, it's not subject to market forces really as to whether or not these railroads should have been there. We can tell that they were definitely overbuilt, but the scale of that we're not actually going to be able to know because there aren't any market forces to tell to basically signal to us should there be railroads or not.
Mm-hmm.
I would be willing to bet that like 3/4 of these railroads didn't need to exist.
Right.
Especially by 1900. So
or another way to put it is, how does the real organic actual free market works? It works in a more incremental way as people actually want it, right? So it isn't that all it isn't necessary that some of it just would have never been built, probably. Some of it might have been built, but built when it was the right time and when people had actually saved the money, really wanted that, there was a demand for it. But they were just building tracks to nowhere. Well, no one's there yet, but if we build the tracks, someone will be there.
Yeah.
You know, if you build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come was literally the motto of a lot of the railroad construction.
And for the people listening, he's not joking when he says that. This was the policy regarding settlement of the West. If there's a railroad there, we can direct where the people are going to go settle these Great Plains. So we'll just start building to nowhere.
Right. So super speculative with the busts, the booms and busts that you would expect from such nonsense, right? Because I think when we talk about railroad construction, probably the first thing that comes into people's mind is, oh, well, that's great. They were connecting, Memphis to Atlanta, that needs to be done, right? That sort of seems sensible. No, you don't understand. They were connecting nowhere to nowhere, expecting that something would happen if they did it. And then they would complete the line and nobody would use it. And they would start, going out of business and stuff, right?
But not nuts. Before starting on the next nowhere to nowhere line.
Yes. Okay, so give you a taste of the practices. We'll be hearing about more of them as we go and get into corruption and stuff. Cities and towns were routinely blackmailed to provide taxpayer funding if they did not wish to be bypassed by railroads under construction or railroads that were merely planned. So the railroads would get subsidies from the federal government. They'd get subsidies from the state governments. They would go to a town and say, hey, if you don't treat us right, your town's going to be a ghost town because we're going to route right around you and no one's going to want to be here anymore, right? Which did, of course, happen. And happened with the highway system later. That movie Cars from Pixar, they dramatized that, right? In the movie, there's a town that's just a nowheresville because the highway went around them. And it had used to be a big stop on Route 66. But then the highway went a different direction, and now the town was just dead, right? Well, that's what they were threatening to do to you, basically, these railroads, if you didn't play ball, right? So it's just thoroughly corrupt.
Just to clarify this, so it doesn't sound contradictory, migration with already established towns is a lot different than migration to new areas. So the trend that you would see here, if a railroad connecting a town to another place does not go into your already established town, people are likely going to leave that town because there's better connection in other places. But if you're just building roads to nowhere, you're building roads to nowhere. Like, people are going to settle where they're going to settle. It's colonization. The two don't contradict, just preempting that possible confusion.
Okay, then there'll be more to say. There's so much we could say about railroads, but the tariff. Okay, well, no surprise. Lincoln started the war explicitly. Read his first inaugural, I think. He explicitly started it over tariffs. And so, surprise, surprise, the average tariff collected on dutiable items, that is, items to which the tariff applied, increased from 19% in fiscal 1861 to 48% in fiscal 1865. So that is, with the war ending, they have already bumped this up over 200% from where it was on the tariffs.
Yep.
And okay, well, there's going to be more to say. Going to be more to say on that, I think. Okay, why don't you cover the banking system?
All right. So, this is you can really see the Hamiltonian system continuing whenever banks get brought up. The radicals establish a new banking system, and they did this one really insidiously, because if you just put one central bank, this is the Bank of the United States, that's a really easy political target. And they were tired of doing that. They had tried it multiple times now, and it just prompts a reaction. It gets abolished later. So, what are they going to do? How are they going to fix this? Are they going to go for round 4? No. What they're actually going to do is they're going to decentralize the system while keeping the regulations. So instead of the one central administration, they're going to hand out charters to all these different federal banks. I think that was the term that they were called. And they were going to set restrictions with these charters on capital requirements and reserve requirements. And to make sure that people used these banks, they also passed a series of regulations that essentially made it impossible to operate without being a part of the system. What this also does is they established one source of currency in the federal government, because they're the ones chartering and licensing the banks now. Your state or your company, it's going to be a lot harder to legally mint currency. So they're shutting down one of the last forms of decentralization that these states had at this point outside of politics, which was the currency decentralization. Like, you were free to use and make any currency you want. Not anymore. You need licenses, and you need to pass these regulations now. They also set a precedent. They extended the wartime measure of greenbacks, which was the fiat currency, into Reconstruction, into peacetime, to finance their ever larger endeavors. This is how they were paying for all those railroads and stuff like that. They were printing money. They had the money printer going. This is also weird because we have another currency from the federal government that is still on the gold standard, but both hold the same legality. They're both the same currency. One's just fiat, and this is actually hilarious because what this is the gold-backed currency is the non-radical Republican currency, and the radical Republican currency are the greenbacks. Like, this is what it develops into. It's like a political divide. So that's what happened with banking here. Do you have anything else to add on that?
Just so many evils that come from this time. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
Okay. No, let's keep going. So, Moral Land Grant Act.
Yeah, so the federal government itself, it actually confiscated land. They weren't just administering it, they confiscated actual land, and they had land out west. I don't know if you remember from any previous discussions about the Wild West or anything like that, homesteading. The federal government actually, and it had the army, so that's how it backed the claim. It said, we own all the unclaimed land out west, and now we own this land in the south that we confiscated. Completely disregarding any principles around homesteading, any sensible things like that. So, what are they going to do with this land? Well, Congress passes the Moral Land Grant Act, and this is extending the American system to public education. They were going to issue land to different universities, agricultural or mechanical, and these were going to be like the federally funded university systems that were going to be in the new United States after the Civil War. Most of them are still around today. Yep. They just rebranded. If you had an agricultural or mechanical school, they usually rebranded to the state university. So I'll use the example of Oklahoma since I'm near to that. Oklahoma State University used to be Oklahoma A&M from the Moral Land Grant Act.
Right. So, yeah. So I remember they talk about the ags.
Yep.
right? Oklahoma Ag or whatever, or it'd
Yeah.
be A&M if it's both.
Hmm.
Texas A&M, that was a big name. I don't know if are they still called that. Anyway, Texas A&M was a big school for a long time, or
Yes.
one that you'd hear about, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, it did. The government's relationship to higher education, right?
Yeah,
which,
and
which has borne
that's
such bitter fruit in our last couple years. We've been really noticing it, right?
yes, we have, and the whole thing has just been a terrible system from start to end. Like it's produced some great things, but it could have been done way better by any other system.
Right. Okay, and then you point out, so the Southern occupation governments, the carpetbaggers, the freedmen, the scalawags, they allowed the Northern economic system, or well, to be fair, we should call it the Hamiltonian, right, the American economic
Yeah.
system,
Yes.
to be implemented nationwide. Increased tariffs, subsidies for manufacturing, subsidies for infrastructure, railroads,
Yep.
and so forth, right? Um, and yeah, we already went over that. Let's see. Yeah, property taxes. So, oh, sorry, got to spin to my book here. Right. So, this did, I think they did back off. There's a slightly happy ending to this part, but under the Reconstruction period, which is about, I don't know, something like 10 years after the war, is sort of the height of Reconstruction, right, Ryan?
Yes.
Though it really has never stopped in certain respects, right? But you could say there's things that happen during those 10 years, some of which stop happening or get dialed down quite a bit after that 10 years is
Right.
up.
Right.
Well, once states start rejoining the union, they start getting um, the whites start getting to vote again, and things start changing a bit eventually.
Yeah, we'll get there. It's in the
Yeah,
next
we'll get there.
two
But
slides or so.
let's see, where is it? Yeah, so the war devastated South endured some of the highest property taxes in relation to wealth in the history of the United States. So
Hmm.
remember, this is as we went through, the South was absolutely devastated. Many men killed, farms destroyed, and then they lay on these super heavy property taxes, right?
Yeah.
So even though 1870 property values in the 11 former rebel states were less than half the value that they were in 1860, and the pre-war values, right? The
Hmm.
amount of property taxes paid for that same land that was now worth half as much was 4 times greater. So the relative burden increased eightfold. So like an 8 times uptick relative to the value of the property, right? Because the
Right.
property being devalued by the war and destruction and property taxes being pushed up. Why did they want all these property taxes? Because they wanted to educate everybody now, good old Yankee government schools everywhere,
Hmm.
and various other projects, and live like kings in the legislature and so forth. Now listen to this. This is a Republican state senator in South Carolina named William Beverly Nash, an ex-slave, and he was unsympathetic. So I thought this quote was interesting. He said, white Democrats complain of taxes being too high. I tell you, they are not high enough. I want them taxed until they put these lands back where they belong, into the hands of those who worked for them. You, ex-slaves, worked for them. You labored for them and were sold to pay for them, and you ought to have them. Now, I found that quote interesting because that actually is one of the first good arguments I've heard on sort of the Reconstruction side. Murray Rothbard wrote about desocialization when the Soviet
Uh-huh.
Union collapsed. He said, all these decades and centers for the study of the Soviet Union and communism and all this anti-communism and all that, nobody thought what would happen if it actually ended. Like, what will these countries do?
Right.
And so he wrote a paper suggesting what, from a libertarian point of view, should be done. He said, well, if the people were working in a factory, and there's no real good way to, give that factory back to who originally owned it before the revolution or before the Bolshevik Revolution, then the workers who worked there, the workers and managers who were there, should all get like shares or something, and they should be the owners, right?
Right, I
So,
recall that, yes.
yeah, so this argument actually has a certain amount of sense to it. But of course, that is not what the North did.
Right.
Okay,
So,
so property taxes. What else?
deficit spending.
Debt spending. Yeah, yeah. So
Yes.
they're doing all this crazy stuff. They're living like kings. Yeah, lavish spending on the carpetbagger legislatures. Here's an example. A single session of Louisiana's carpetbag legislature cost 10 times that of any of the state's antebellum legislatures. So they set up these new legislatures dominated by, radical Republicans and carpetbaggers and so forth. And then they paid themselves very handsomely, and they
Yep.
had the finest of food for their legislative sessions and all this stuff. This had a lasting impact on the South, which we'll get to. I just don't want to forget to mention it. This complete abuse by government officials, lavish, wasteful spending, and debt funded. So,
right, and
so they acquired a huge amount of debt to do all these behaviors and hand stuff to the railroads, et cetera, et cetera.
and that sounds like normal behavior to us now, but I'm going to tell you all of the paradise that once existed in the United States. Antebellum, politicians at least made the public veneer that they cared about not going too far into debt.
Right, right.
So this is a really radical change. The carpetbaggers and the scalawags and the army take control of these governments, and they start saying, "We're just going to deficit spend."
Yeah.
It's insane.
Right, and I don't think I have it noted in the notes, but it talks about once they stopped spending like crazy and got things under control, after they got rid of the carpetbag governments, it would take them till like 1920 to finish paying back all the debt.
Yeah.
That had been acquired during that 10 years that the carpetbagger governments. So yeah, it was just nuts. They were just destroying these states. Okay, what else do we want to highlight? Yeah, I shared this on Twitter. Got to share it with you all. In one example of the excesses that were going on at this time, the carpetbag manager of the state-owned railroad explained that he was able to bank $30,000 a year for himself out of a $3,000 annual salary by, and I have to give him points for creativity, by exercising the most rigid economy, which, if you don't know, that would be a word for thrift, basically.
Yeah.
I know how to pinch my pennies, and that's how I turned my $3,000 annual salary into $30,000 a year. Incredible. We'll be seeing more things like that soon. Let's see. Yeah, so what is the this thing about rhetoric shifted from development to making the New South? What do you mean?
Right. So, up until this point in time, the American system was about development. It was about developing infrastructure, developing the industry, develop, build up, build up.
Mm-hmm.
The rhetoric shifted from that to reform. This needs to take on a different form. It's going to change. So in the South, the rhetoric shifted from we're going to build up the manufacturing industry to be like the Northeast and Pennsylvania and New York, to we are going to be the New South. We're going to change things. Like the rhetoric shift is something to take note of as well.
Ryan, you could almost say that they wanted to build the South back better.
Yes, you could exactly say that. That's what they're doing. And this is a very successful propaganda initiative because it continues on up until like I think the 1930s. People make reference to it still. So like that's like two presidential political systems later, and the propaganda is still there.
Right.
So
okay, let's see. Oh, we got to mention the union pensions. I had heard just in my reading over the years, whatever, I'd heard something about union pensions, and I was like, what? I'm not, it's like a fly. I'm just like batting the fly away. No. You don't understand. The union pensions became a way to buy votes. And they went absolutely bananas with this, such that by 1893, union veteran pensions were an astounding 40% of the federal budget. So nearly half of what the federal government was spending was on Union veterans' pensions. Well, what did that mean? Well, at first it was, if you were injured during the war or something like that, then you get a pension.
Mhm.
Eventually it was, if your brother died in the war or got hurt, you get a pension.
Right.
If you knew somebody who, it got ridiculous. And the absurdity of it is highlighted by the fact that as late as 2016, I'm not kidding, everyone listening to the show was alive. As late as 2016, there was still a recipient collecting a monthly stipend that was under this Union veterans pension thing.
Yeah,
so they were
$73 a month. Yeah.
Yeah, they were handing money out to all kinds of people, basically to buy votes. They were doing it, of course, with deficit spending and money printing, and just nuts.
Yeah. Only the Union veterans, as I mentioned earlier in the show. The Confederates got nothing.
Right. So, let's see. I'm gonna skip. Okay, sorry. One more railroad fact. That's gonna be my new thing. Railroad facts. One more railroad fact I should have mentioned earlier when we're covering railroads. To give you an idea of the land grant subsidy issue, where the states would give the railroads land. I mean, they would give them 500 acres around the track or something. And you're probably picturing like, oh well, you do need a little, you need to be able to clear the land and not have trees falling on your track. You need a little room around the track. No, they give them like 500 acres in a checkerboard pattern down the track. Across the whole country. Yeah. So
it's a really long tree to clear there.
Exactly. Right. So the Northern Pacific Railroad alone, for example, was granted 44 million acres, which is roughly the size of my own state of Missouri. Missouri is not small, by the way. It is a very humongous state that takes a long time to drive around in.
I think it's bigger in land area than the United Kingdom. I think the United Kingdom's about the size of Alabama, and Missouri's bigger than that. So,
right,
that's the scope you're dealing with there.
So, what was the result of all this? Let me give some summary. So, 5 years after the war, Southern property values had increased because they were at a low point right at the end of the war. I mean, everything was destroyed, and who wanted to buy land in the South in 1865, right? Well, actually, they did. That's what carpetbaggers did. They came down and bought land while it was bottom. They saw that it was at a bottom and jumped on it. Anyway, so 5 years later, it had increased 63%, whereas wealth in the northern states increased by 150% over those same 5 years, from 1865 to 1870. So what's the point here? The point is, the story I think that needs to be understood is that the North, as I said, was already plundering the South through the tariff system because the industry was in the North, the agriculture was in the South, so they could adjust the tariffs basically to favor the industrial side and disfavor the South, where they were selling food and bringing manufactured products in. Well, they'd put this high tariff on the manufactured products so that the South ended up having to buy from the North and at higher prices, right? So they were already plundering the South. Well, then they do the war and they steal everything they can lay their hands on. And then after the war is over, they have tariffs and more that we're going to tell you. And it has the expected effect. The North gets rich and the South is kept poor, right? I mean, that's exactly what you'd expect from all this. And that's, in fact, what we see in the stats. So increasingly, Northerners began to treat the South economically as an internal colony. It was to be a source of raw materials and a secondary market for Northern manufactured goods. Well, how did they do this? As you may know, or you may not know if you're not an American, whereas national tariffs became a matter of big, started a war in my view, tariffs between states were unconstitutional. And no one, as far as I know, ever challenged that.
Yep.
That always has been there from the Constitution from 1787. So how could we get these differential effects? Well, this is something I learned researching for this show. This is part of the reason I do the show, because I want to learn. Freight rates, the rates for transporting freight on the railroads. Freight rates in the South were artificially inflated. This Georgia governor accused the North of keeping the South in a colonial status in which it served as the economic doormat of the United States, as Ireland was to the United Kingdom. Let me share a little more, just getting a quote ready. Okay. As a means of impeding competition from Southern and Western manufacturers, the discriminatory rates were as effective as protective tariffs, which were constitutionally prohibited between states. So the railroads are political creatures, as we've been highlighting. They're totally in bed with the politicians. They're bribing politicians. It's this cozy relationship, if you can imagine such a thing.
They're the Reconstruction analogy of today's government and the tech companies.
This
like that's
where Biden gets elected and suddenly like some guy from Facebook is in the White House, right? Not just one guy, but a bunch of them, right? That's what's happening here. The railroad guys are like in the White House in the case of Lincoln, or in the administration in various roles, and vice versa, right? So there's that we call it the rotating door. Am I using the right term? Yeah, there's that rotating door back there, but it's the railroad industry and the government back then. Okay, then let's see, page 77. All right. The chief exceptions to higher Southern freight charges were commodity rates for raw materials. I wanted to read this because this highlights this point. This the governor made, right? No, sorry. Where was it? That the author made that the South would be a source of raw materials, right? So they'd get these huge freight rates for some things they did, like bringing manufactured goods in. But if you were shipping cotton, sugar, iron ore, coal, petroleum out of the South, you got low rates, right? So feed our northern industry for cheap.
Right, yeah.
And then pay through the nose when we ship the manufactured good back to you. Got the game? Okay. The prime beneficiaries were the northern manufacturers that transformed the raw materials into finished goods. So that is the scam that they were doing. One more quote here. Yeah, it took 80 years for the South to start getting some relief from regional railroad rate discrimination. So this went on much longer than that sort of 10-year Reconstruction period. They put a system in place and it stayed. And I think we'll see more of that. The Northerners, the carpetbaggers, they came down, they bought stuff up. Eventually they left, most of them, but they still owned a lot, and they just run it from the north, basically, and just collect the profits.
Yeah, we'll get to them leaving. Right. That's a key point.
Okay, so let's see, two more quotes here. There was general plunder involving every species of intrigue, speculation, and theft. A general practice was observed of regarding everything left in the country as the legitimate prize of the first officer who discovers it. And then, and then, again, just summarizing the results, and this time from someone who my Yankee friends might listen to, General Sherman. Yes, that General Sherman. 2 years after the war ended. Ready? He who had earlier led his army on a destructive march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah. He wrote, "Look to the south, and you who went with me through that land can best say if they too have not been fearfully punished. Mourning in every household, desolation written in broad characters across the whole face of their country. Cities in ashes and fields laid waste, their commerce gone, their system of labor annihilated and destroyed, ruin, poverty, and distress everywhere, and now pestilence." So the South did not rise again, at least not then. It was in a bad way.
It was quite violently.
Okay,
put
anything
down.
else before we go back to slides, because I've been showing the two of us. Anything else about American system and Reconstruction before we go on to the next slide?
So we have what the actual economic measures were taken against the South, and this has about the effect that you would think. These tariffs, keeping machinery, manufactured goods artificially high, and having state intervention to keep any raw materials coming out of the South artificially low, keeps most of the Southern population in poverty well into the 1920s. and it just stays that way. They're in almost destitute poverty, and we touched on some of that in the history of the blacks episodes that we did, and part of the some of the things that they would do to get by was sharecropping, because things were so bad that you couldn't get by on like your own one family farm anymore. You actually had to band together with people around you, and hopefully someone richer than you, to pay for the northern manufactured goods and machinery to keep your farm and keep your livelihood. Like this was keeping the South in poverty at the benefit of everyone else in the country.
Okay, shall we go back to the slides? Okay, so
yeah. Here's the
congressional
fun part.
coup d'etat.
Yes. So the first note that I had in terms of the story is like you really should have seen this coming by now if you hadn't already assumed that Congress just controlled the country. Here they formally subsume the responsibilities of the Supreme Court and the executive branch. So Congress gave itself the power in the Tenure of Office Act to basically control the president's cabinet, which are the people in the executive branch that actually administer executive policy. So now if Johnson's still president, the Southern Democrat, in the poor situation that he was in, now he can't even control his own cabinet, half of which is staffed by radicals from Lincoln's administration. And then with the Supreme Court, Congress passes a law, and I forget the names because it's a bunch of legal Latin terms. Basically what happens is there was a court case about the imprisonment of opposition media in the South that had reached the Supreme Court, and Congress passed an act before the Supreme Court that could review it that basically just said this is out of jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It's just going to carry on as it's in law. So Congress now controls the executive branch, and they control what the Supreme Court can see. This is a coup d'etat. If this happened in some African country, the media would be on fire saying this body in whatever country just couped their government and they're now leading it with an iron fist. This happened here. Johnson, stubborn Southerner that he was, tried to fight this even though all of the cards were stacked against him. He fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was responsible for spearheading the policy of imprisoning newspaper owners. Congress reinstated him. He fired him again, and this time Stanton locked himself in the War Department and refused to leave. And there was a good cartoon about it. It had Stanton drawn in like a dress, like girly hides in his room trying to get away from Johnson. And then now Congress reinstates him and impeaches Johnson. So this is the first instance of articles of impeachment actually being passed against a president in U.S. history. It goes to the Senate, which is completely controlled by radicals, and Johnson remains president by a margin of 1 vote. That's it. So he was still in charge of the executive branch, but that was it. He was sidelined. He's out of the picture now until the next election, and he's not running again.
Okay, next slide.
Over. So, yeah, Congress is running the country now.
So now, the most corrupt administration.
Yes. This is election year now. All of this happened right at the tail end of Johnson's term. The next election is Ulysses S. Grant winning in a landslide because he carries most of the Union and the South due to the fortified elections that we mentioned earlier. Cooperating with carpetbaggers, scalawags, freedmen, soldiers. Ulysses S. Grant wins in a landslide, but just barely wins the popular vote, which doesn't matter. It's just a measurement of popularity. He would be, at this point in history, the most corrupt presidential administration, but in reality, he's just setting the trend. Like, this is just how things are going to be now. We just know about this stuff quite famously.
Right, so shall I share this example? His Secretary of the Navy. Okay, so we got another amazing penny pincher here. His Secretary of the Navy, George Robeson, made deposits of $320,000 during the time he was Secretary of the Navy on a salary of $8,000 a year. Let's make sure you caught those numbers. He was making $8,000 a year, and he made deposits of $320,000. And this went through. Grant had a lot of family members, a lot of nepotism. 40 family members were in the administration, one place or another. A number of them were involved with scandals.
Yep.
Let's see.
And the ones that weren't formally in office were surrounding
Right.
those that were in office. So like hired positions, appointees, people like that.
Grant took care of his tribe. Maybe we could put it that way to some of our friends.
Yes, yes, he did very well.
And then, you mentioned here, Grant let Congress operate as it wanted to, for just a few concessions on currency and westward expansion. And then let's talk about the first scandal. Okay, so Credit Mobilier is later in his second administration, right? So talk about Black Friday 1869.
Yes. Okay, so a year after this guy gets elected, we get the first scandal. Ulysses S. Grant actually wasn't too terrible when it came to fiscal policy. He was a big fan of the gold standard, really didn't like the greenbacks, really didn't like inflation. And this was just part of his plans. It wasn't an isolated policy of we're doing this. Something that his administration was planning on doing was selling some of the gold supply in the government, just being held up in the government. There's a guy named Jay Gould. He was a Erie Railroad director. There's that connection. He worked with Grant's brother-in-law. They were big into the gold market at the time. So they had a plan. They were going to get the government to stop selling gold so that they could buy most of the gold on the East Coast market at the time, drive up the price, make money off of it, especially because they have that administration connection. So the government goes along with it. They various people along the way, except for Grant himself, if I recall correctly, accepted tens of thousands of dollars in bribes, and eventually gold reached $141 an ounce, and this is $1869. So I don't actually have the conversion today, but that's an exorbitant amount of money for 1 ounce of gold.
For what the dollar meant at the time.
Yes, at the time. Grant saw this, didn't like it. He thought something was going on, so he wrote a letter to Gold saying,
Jay Gould,
the guy that was doing all this, telling him he was going to start selling the gold again to stop this madness. So even when he was trying to fix the problem, he clued the guy in. He secretly started selling off his gold. And the government started selling gold that Friday. It crashed the market for gold, and it was known as Black Friday. Thankfully, Grant wasn't incompetent, so it was just a scare. It lasted about a month or so.
But a big downturn, a big market crash. Ryan had asked, did I find any evidence in the book I read about Grant himself being corrupt, or was it just everyone around him somehow? I found this. Grant's sympathies. Oh, okay. Sorry, I should mention Jay Cook. Jay Cook was a big railroad man. All right. And very corrupt.
Yep.
Grant's sympathies shifted to the wealthy classes after he became accustomed to gifts, such as donations of residential and vacation homes from men like Jay Cook. So not subtle. Just here's a couple houses, buddy.
Yeah,
and it worked. That's the key thing. It worked. Okay, so let's see. There we go. Corruption, more corruption. Okay, we could go on and on, but let's try to move through this real quick. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I said I was going to do this in a rapid fire style. So here's like the highlights of the Grant administration's corruption. So the New York Customs House suffered a scandal. Grant's appointees were found to have run a corrupt smuggling ring. The stewards of America's largest port, New York City, were caught charging high fees for various actions, storing unclaimed goods on the harbor in private warehouses, bypassing inspections, hiding goods in private warehouses owned by Grant's friends and secretaries. That's an interesting one. And basically any action that would involve evading customs laws or tariffs. So that's embezzlement in a very roundabout way. The Star Route Ring. So other side of the country, in the Pacific and the Southwest, Grant's administration handed out contracts and licenses to mail routes on the frontier. They were known as star routes because they weren't the government, so they put an asterisk on the most of the mail they delivered. They frequently just invented routes, told the government they were delivering here and they needed their commission, and they ended up getting $500,000 a year from each of these routes that just went to the pockets of whoever invented the made-up ghost route. So that's one of them. And these were all public; these weren't hidden. These were all major scandals at the time. Grant doubled the president's salary and increased Congress's salary by 33%. After this, we have something called the Sanborn Incident, where Grant's tax collection, believe it or not, was corrupt. I mean, that's insane to all of us, but it gets even better here. The government in the South and in the Midwest would contract tax collection if people weren't paying debts or anything like that, any agreements they made with the governments. And the payment for these contractors was 50% of the debt they collected. The government would pay them that sum. So if they collected $400,000 of debt, they would get paid $200,000 of debt, or $200,000 from the government. So it was a scandal because that's insane. And they were collecting money in those quantities.
By the way, this puts in mind like the biblical tax collectors, right? That everybody hated so much, right?
Yes.
It was sort of in the New Testament, it's used as a word like scum, basically. You know, if you're a tax collector, that essentially is another way of saying like you are scum. Yeah. And that's why, because of this stuff, because of crap like this.
And something else about this as well is that most of the times they were dishonest in the amount they were collecting. Once again, paralleling the New Testament tax collectors who supposedly had false weights on their measurements and would collect more than they should have. So that's the tax collection fraud. Multiple departments, the Justice Department and the Department of the Interior, if I remember correctly, they were paying salaries to employees that either did not exist, so they're writing down that Joe Brown works for this courthouse and we need a salary for him now. Or they would hire people who did nothing and just pay them, usually their friends or cronies or things along those lines. There's the whiskey ring. So whiskey distillers, and this is a fun one. Whiskey distillers in the Midwest would bribe tax collectors to just not come to the Midwest. And this was a Congress and administration-wide thing. So while the rest of the country is paying taxes on all of this, the people in the Midwest, Congress, and supposedly Grant himself, though that was never clarified, just didn't pay any alcohol taxes, which I'm all in favor of not paying taxes, but it's a bit dishonest the way they went about it. The trading post ring, so the Native Americans still have their territories in the West. A government position at the time was overseeing trade posts. So they would be appointed, just administrating affairs between the federal government and the Native Indians. These were, you just bought these offices. It was pure patronage.
And they overcharged. It sounds a little bit like when you buy candy and popcorn at the movie theater, is something like that. They often were kind of the only option, because remember the as we emphasized in the show you and I did on the West is just vast, right? So you've got some trading posts is the only place you can buy stuff, and they take advantage of that, overcharge, and then line their pockets. Anyway, keep going.
Right, and this is that's one of the few things that I say few. That's that there's a valid argument there for usury,
right.
which is a bad word in some places, but so we have the cattle scandal, which that's a name, not the livestock. Cattel. it was a company. It was a grain company. They were given Navy contracts, tying into Radlib's example earlier. So, in exchange for this company paying the debts of various government secretaries and for providing them with vacation homes, racing horses, just straight bribes, they would get Navy contracts and make a ton of money off of them in the same way that the railroads were making tons of money off of their contracts.
Now, wait, did you mention
here's
all
the big one?
You had a little bit more in the notes about how they get paid off, the politicians. Vacation homes, racing horses, cash. You said that.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Sorry, I missed it. Okay.
Yeah, I said
yeah.
that.
Then the big scandal.
Right. So, credit is it mobilier?
I'd say
mobilier. I can't speak French, so yeah. So, this was the federal government contracted Union Pacific Railway to build a transcontinental railroad, and then right after that, Union Pacific Railway made this shell company, Credit Mobilier, and they basically hired, quote unquote, they hired this company to go around, extend the routes of the railroad so they can make more money and get more land out of it. It was used as money laundering so that they didn't have to pay taxes on certain money, so you just put money in there, after taxes, bring it back out, it's perfectly intact. There were congressmen who led this organization and had seats in government. And so what you had was Union Pacific would put money into the shell company, and the congressmen in the shell company would use that money to basically bribe senators and representatives in Congress to pass legislation to expand the scope of Union Pacific. It's a feedback loop, constantly growing, and it's probably one of the best organized corruption rings in
up
U.S.
to the
history.
highest levels. Mention who they implicated.
So, in Congress, this was opened up to the public right before Grant got reelected, and this implicated 8 Republicans, and originally it was 1 Northern Democrat, if I remember correctly, who was then later. It was later proven that he knew nothing about it. He just had talks with the leader of the company. So the people that were involved in this were the Republicans who had dominance of the government at the time and were running these infrastructure development projects. Big surprise.
Oh, and did you mention? I don't think you mentioned the vice president.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Yeah, the vice president as well. Sorry, that was a. That was the other big.
Right
one.
Up to the top.
So, Grant's vice president, who was also the leader of the Senate before he was the vice president. I believe it was Schuyler Colfax.
I mean, what has changed since then? I mean, they talk about Grant being so corrupt. I mean, he seems to just have been surrounded by people who were just shameless and dumb and just kept getting caught. That's part of it. But also, I think this was a new burst of corruption because of, the American system being put in place. And in that first new, fresh, virginal experience of corruption, people didn't take as kindly to it. And by now, it's just business as usual. And we don't even necessarily think of it as corruption. It's just the way the system works or something,
Exactly. And so it is new, and it has to be new because this is a extremely insane scope of the government compared to what it was just 30 years earlier. So there's more opportunity for corruption, as you can see with trading posts, with railway companies, with different postal routes throughout the transcontinental area. It is completely new, but now it is just business as normal because this didn't go away. The Grant administration's biggest flaw was just that they got caught. They aren't particularly this stuff is nothing compared to some of the stuff that we could see in other presidential administrations.
Later, okay, well, let's keep rolling. Next slide, if I can get it. There we go. The Army heads south again.
So up until this point, Reconstruction was kind of the North. It was getting unpopular to just keep an army and keep paying for it and keep administering the South. So Grant and then Johnson, to a lesser extent, at the end of his term, was trying to pull troops out of the South. But then there were a bunch of large-scale riots and political instances of political violence. So this became deeply unpopular for Grant's administration, where the radical Republicans once again painted him as being very lenient for Reconstruction.
Never hardcore enough for the radical Republicans, right?
Correct. So they passed, it was called the Enforcement Act, or the Ku Klux Klan Act. Basically what it did was it gave Grant the legal powers to suspend a habeas corpus in counties that they deemed where there was paramilitary violence. And it gave Grant the power to send armies down there and imprison anyone that they might even suspect as being a part of these paramilitary groups. This continued until Grant's next term. And you might be thinking to yourself, if all these things were public, if he's doing all these unpopular things, he's angered the radicals in his party who controlled the government, how on earth did he get reelected? Well, here's the great choices that you have in the United States. The 1872 election, your options were Ulysses S. Grant or Horace Greeley. If you remember from the last episode that we did, Horace Greeley was the insanely radical Whig who ran the New York Tribune. He's the guy that hired Karl Marx. Those were your options in the election. Grant won with a landslide, but there were no options at all. So the last part of his term is the time frame for some of those scandals in the last slide to take place. Other than that, and we'll get to this in the end of the slides, he's busy in the West, making treaties and abandoning treaties with the natives. So, but with the Enforcement Act, what this does is it reverses the trend and it puts more troops back into the South, and this is going to cause a backlash that we're going to see later, and it's going to cause the Republicans' hold on the South to become untenable. It's so unpopular at this point, and they're having like outright violence against them that they just have to withdraw in some capacity.
All right, so House election 1874. This is Greeley and Grant? No. Oh, okay.
No, this is after that.
Oh, midterms. Oh, okay. So, I see.
Yeah, so this is after he's put troops back into the South. If you just look at the colors on the map, it's not looking good for red.
Yeah. So Republicans are in red, Democrats are in blue, and then there's some independents. And the Republicans had decided they were just going to have a one-party state from now on, and they screwed it so badly that they actually lost the House. They didn't lose the Senate. They just lost a supermajority in the Senate, I think. But they lost the House as a result of all this nonsense. And you're saying that's really 1874. 9 years after the end of the war, that's the end of the radical Republicans being so dominant.
Yeah, this is the beginning of the end, if you will. So, Grant was not doing the Republicans any favors, because unlike the presidential election, you actually did have choices in most of these areas. So you had Democrats, you had actual Republicans that might not have been so corrupt, you had the independents that you can see there in Wisconsin and parts of the South. They got slaughtered in the midterms because no one wanted this, and they weren't there to fortify the elections anymore because it was costing too much money and they were getting shot at. So this is where you start seeing the collapse of the Scalawag, Carpetbagger, Freedmen, soldier coalitions. And part of that's due to paramilitary violence, and the other part of that is due to the fact that even some of their own supporters were starting to distance themselves from the Republicans, just because they had mismanaged things so much.
Okay, let's keep going. So, and paramilitaries in the Shadow War.
Yeah, so by this point, you basically have a low-level war in the South. You're not getting people into power, Republican or Democrat, without some form of extra legal force. So the Republicans that stayed in power mostly did so because that's where the army was. And the Democrats that got power did so because they had paramilitary groups, and we'll go through them one by one, that kicked out the coalition forces back to the north or lynched them. So no one's winning here. Like it's not like antebellum South looks like a perfect paradise compared to this, where everyone's shooting at each other and lynching each other, or occupying each other to keep their party in power. So we have the Klan is the one that's really popularized, but they didn't even do that much. They were covert, quote unquote. That's a code for they didn't like to do much. So what you actually had were paramilitaries that were very public about what they were doing. One of these was the Red Shirts. They began in Mississippi. They just paraded through town wearing specifically red shirts to separate themselves from freedmen or scalawags. And this quickly spread through most of the South. And they worked openly and publicly. They broke down Republican meetings. They took over polls and started to administer them. They kidnapped and beat politicians. But they also used less violent methods. They held barbecues. They held rallies. They organized state tours for politicians. So I don't mean to be lenient to the people like going out and just beating random people off the street until they vote a certain way. But like most of this stuff is a reaction to the insane amounts of tyranny that you saw in Reconstruction earlier. Like this is it's kind of boiled over now. Even bigger than the Red Shirts, you have the White Leagues, who were mostly ex-Confederates, also operated openly, but they had a lot better backing than the Red Shirts. So they often they have better equipment. They often brandished new rifles, revolvers. They had horses, bigger and stronger than sometimes the soldiers even had. And they were so wide in scope that they incorporated themselves into the state militias and the National Guards. So you use the military on the South, and now you have another military taking it over because that's the only option left. That's one of the big issues here. It's not well for anyone. And so those were the two really organized ones. Then you also have white capping, which is just it's a term for vigilante mobs that usually went to lynch corrupt politicians, freedmen, carpetbaggers, or scalawags. This isn't unique to the time period. They started in the 1830s when they originally were lynching people that were seen to have loose morals, prostitutes, women that were having children out of wedlock, things like that. Vigilante violence, mind you. It just came to the South, and now they were doing it to the Republicans that had occupied the states. So it's a full-on low-level war, and the Republicans lost it because they overplayed their hand earlier.
Okay. The last gasp of the radicals.
Yes. So the radicals, they still had the presidency and the Senate. They attempted to pass more civil rights legislation. They attempted to pass, I believe this is where you get the 15th Amendment, though I might have the timing on that wrong, but that's not the main one here. They were trying to pass... actually trying to pass economics bills was this is where you get the real last gasp. They were trying to completely expand the supply of greenbacks and make them the predominant currency of the U.S., the fiat currency, and try to remove the gold standard. Grant vetoed this and instead sent a bill I forget what the technical term is, but he wrote to some of the people in the House and the Senate and told them that he wanted bills strengthening the gold standard before he left office. So, in the face of the radicals, Grant actually phased out the greenbacks and strengthened the gold standard within the U.S. So we ended the dual currency that we were under, and thank God put us back onto the gold standard for at least a while longer. The civil rights that they were trying to pass and all that usually failed, and some of them did pass, but they weren't enforced in the South because the Republicans were gone. Like, there's no one left to enforce it. Besides the few soldiers in the major cities, but they're unpopular too. They can't do anything. So during this time frame, at the end of Grant's presidency, the money supply continued to decrease, and this caused a comfortable recovery from earlier economic downturns, really. Like, Grant wasn't bad when it came to finances, I don't think.
Okay, and then finally the bargain. Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, so wait, I think I wanted to make a comment about Reconstruction. No, let's do this first. I want to make a comment about the whole Reconstruction
Okay.
thing, but this puts the period to that first Reconstruction period.
Right. So, this is the end. The 1876 presidential election is one of the more famous ones in history. You have a Democrat from the South, Samuel Tilden, versus Rutherford B. Hayes, which was moderate, not actually moderate, just the political faction. Tilden won the popular vote by 300,000, and Hayes won the electoral vote by 1.
After some crazy wrangling.
Yes. So, what this was, a lot of people at the time thought this was the stage being set for the Second Civil War. The South was ready to try again and support Tilden for the presidency. They were ready to march on Washington if it came to that. And people from the outside also thought this was about to be another civil war. Hayes met with Tilden, and they made a bargain where Rutherford B. Hayes would get the presidency, and in exchange, Tilden would concede his run for the end of Reconstruction, so actually declaring the end and pulling everyone out. At least one Southern Democrat would get a cabinet position, so they aren't being sidelined from administration on the national level. Another transcontinental railroad would be built through the South because he wanted, for whatever reason, more development in Texas was the line. He wanted tariffs and subsidies to be decreased so that the South could actually get out of the insane amounts of debt that it was in. And there's another point.
But it doesn't matter because you're saying only part of this happened anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So the only things that actually happened was that Reconstruction ended and the Southern Democrat got the office of postmaster. So the Republicans, in their true fashion, agreed to this, got the presidency, got the power, ended the important parts of their policy from the Republican standpoint, and didn't even carry out the rest of them. Complete snakes. So, and the cartoon that you can see there, is the demon named Mephistopheles or something like that from it's from the Tale of Faust. That is Conkling, who was a Republican figure at the time, basically handing in a Faustian bargain Rutherford B. Hayes the Solid South being betrayed by the woman, and it's a Faustian bargain because in the process of doing so, the Republicans completely lost the South and most of the Midwest until the 20s. Right. So they got the presidency for, I believe, 4 years, but lost their occupation. So from the perspective of the Republicans, this was a terrible deal. From the perspective of the Democrats, could have been a great deal, but it didn't get carried out, so it was terrible. No one won. But there wasn't a civil war again.
Right, so we're going to draw some larger conclusions, but just commenting on Reconstruction itself. The funny thing is, I think the mainstream history, well, it's kind of been shifting back to the older view that Reconstruction was really, the South was treated badly and stuff, right? For a while there, the radical Republican view was kind of the main thing you heard. And now there's more nuance if you actually study real historians. I don't know what the kids are getting in school,
Yes. You get the full radical.
Yeah. But the professional historians are actually giving a more nuanced story at this point. Having said that, it's funny. The radical Republican story is that Reconstruction was a failure. The question is, in what sense was it a failure, right? So kind of you could say both sides agree it was a failure, but for different reasons, right? So one side would say it was a failure because it was corrupt, wasteful. Instead of bringing harmony in the South, within the communities in the South, it brought lasting legacy of bitterness between black and white. That's a little more complicated story, which we're not going to be able to cover today. Because the hostility, the racial hostility that has all been drummed into our heads, actually doesn't come about till like 1890. for political reasons that have to do with something else.
Yep.
But the Populist Party and stuff, which we just can't even get into it. But they were able to play off the way the blacks were used really by the Republicans during this Reconstruction period. Namely, they used the blacks to hold on to power in the southern states, right? They're like, okay, we'll give you the vote. We'll take the vote away from all the whites, basically, because they had fought for the Confederacy. And you get to lord it over for a little while. Then we'll get bored, we'll wander away, and you'll still be living with these people who now are pretty pissed off at you, right? So there were multiple quotes in the book from people saying, man, the blacks got shafted on this deal, I mean,
and
they got used and abused and then discarded, and then just there was just this legacy of bitterness,
And for the most part, I say the most part, for all of them, I don't know I can think of one. It wasn't the blacks implementing policy of extreme tariffs or confiscation or fortifying elections or anything like that. They're one of the few groups that just wanted to be left alone.
Yeah. That's true.
And then the Republicans came down and occupied the South, and the anger got turned towards the blacks because they voted them in, and now the blacks have to deal with the angry mobs of paramilitaries because the Republicans are just leaving.
The radical Republican, the scalawag governments do a horrible job, famously corrupt, and the reason they're in office is because they told the freedmen, hey, trust us, we were the ones who freed you from slavery or whatever, right? And so we'll take care of you. And so they were like, oh, okay, well, this is all new to them, right? They'd never voted before, and they didn't have like a political culture and all this, So they vote for them, and then they're terrible. The people they vote in are just awful. I don't think even the freedmen liked how what they did, right? Because it wasn't doing it wasn't doing anybody any good in the South, and then they get abandoned and discarded. So not the first time that American blacks are used as what I call a stalking horse, that is used temporarily and then thrown under the bus, and the people who tell them, oh, we're the ones who really care about you, in fact are completely screwing them over and leaving them in a big mess, if you think about like Detroit and places like that, right? So we have got to wrap this up. Boy, this has been long. So a couple larger points to draw. Military industrial complex never went back. Or I'm sorry, what am I saying? There really wasn't anything that we could call a military industrial complex before the war between the states, as far as I can tell. Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah. And that bears out because there was no real major standing army before the Civil War. It was anytime there was a war, you called up people from state militias and various drafting offices, and you say, hey, we've got a war to fight. We need you to come and fight it for us. And they go off to fight. Now that the Civil War's over, the draft has been implemented. The government has proven that it will just print fiat money to finance anything that it's doing. And it's also intrinsically linked itself to arms manufacturing and naval manufacturing in a way that is still true today.
Right, and as your picture brings to mind, one of the images you chose here brings to mind, not only was all this stuff done by the victorious Republicans in the South, but then the Union Army turns its attention to the Plains and starts committing a genocide on the Plains Indians. And from this we get Custer's Last Stand and all that. That's that whole period, which is a whole nother story, but it's an absolute crime. And it's worth bringing up because sometimes, for whatever reason, people have no sympathy for white Southerners, but maybe they'll have sympathy for Native Americans who were basically minding their own business. And then the Union was like, oh, who else can we shoot? Who else can we despoil and plunder?
Right. And just to be the devil's advocate, it wasn't all the Union initiating violence. There were a couple of tribes that did started,
sure.
if you will, but it was not
it's
all
always
of them.
history's always complicated. But yeah, I mean, the
Yeah.
the brutality was pretty horrendous, and I think was it Sherman, one of
Yeah.
the big Civil War generals, who like one of his last dying things was, "I wish I had killed them all," you know, right? Yeah, it was Sherman.
Yeah, Sherman.
Yeah, so
Yes.
these are not nice people
So,
that get held up as heroes.
uh,
And then finally, the stage sat for intervention and imperialism, right? So the war between the
yes.
states, Reconstruction, I mean, we get it all, right? We get war crimes, we get plunder, we get, running like a colony, so to speak, right? Because the South essentially was run as a
Yep.
colony, or colonies. The southern states were run as colonies for a while. Um, and it's a little bit later, but not too long. And then the Plains Indians, and then soon enough, you've got the Spanish-American War, and the American Empire is on for serious, beyond the borders
Yes.
of North America.
And I would put some of this down to the American system, because what do you do whenever you've like developed everything way past what it should be?
Overdeveloped.
Like, what now? What do we do now? Yeah. Well, we have some poor neighbors near us that have sugar, and that's really valuable. And it also looks nice because they're a mean colonial power, and no one really likes them. So what if we just take their
Right.
islands? Like that's kind of the thought process going on here, and you can see that in the campaign posters. This is later. This is about 30 years after Reconstruction. You get essentially bringing the American system to conquered territories that the U.S. would take over, and they would call it a great success, despite the fact that it had the same problems that the South had during Reconstruction.
I wanted to read this. I wanted to read this McKinley quote. Let's bear in mind the radical Republicans, their sort of religious view of the war. The Battle Hymn of the Republic type stuff, right? Okay, well here we are, 1900, President McKinley, and this would be with the Spanish-American War. The Philippines and Cuba, things like this, concentration camps, right? A very early use of concentration camps. And he says, the American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. So the imperial bullshit begins 120 years ago. But really, as we've been arguing here, it's rooted in the invasion of the South, the occupation of the South, the so-called Reconstruction, which is just plunder of the South. Okay, so let me bring us back to us, and let's do some super chats and wrap this up. We are hitting 3 hours. That's yes,
I think
absolutely,
it was a good 3 hours.
Absolutely, action-packed. I don't think it was fluffy. Okay, so let me make sure I have all the ones. So those Subscribe Star subscribers, I always read theirs first. They can tip us during the tip us on Subscribestar. Advantage of that is you send less money to Google. So some people like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Always a good thing.
Okay, let's see. There was one that was a couple days ago, but I wanted to make sure to read it, from Ike Broflovsky. Great progress on the movie so far. Oh, okay, this is Mad Merck's movie about the Australian Great Depression, which I hadn't mentioned that, right? So this channel put out something else. It's a documentary that Mad Merck worked on, and then life came along and interrupted him. But it's totally watchable. You can nitpick about it, but it's totally watchable, and it teaches you about how Australia handled the Depression in a very different way and had different results.
Yes, it was beautiful as well. Great music it really sets the mood. He has a great way of telling the story. Like, it's not some boring history class. He really brings the figures at the time into like a almost relatable sense.
Absolutely, it's really well done. He was very concerned that it's unfinished. I think, don't worry about it. Watch it. You will be glad you did.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
He says, having trouble watching content live. I hope to hear a stream about the invisible hook soon. I don't know what there's the invisible hand. I don't know what the invisible hook is. I'll have to ask him. Mickey, our friend Mickey says, and the Southern Youth rises. What is it like to be the follow-up for the topic after Tom DiLorenzo himself, Turnip?
I really wish that I could have interviewed him because, man, was he brilliant. He was hitting all the points that he was hitting everything that I was like listening for to like. When you are familiar with the stuff enough, you kind of you can distinguish between like the normal the normie view of the whole thing, and you can if you hear certain things that aren't talked about, you know that the guy really knows what they're talking about, and he hit all of them perfectly. He had a talk released on the Mises Institute channel today, talking about most of the same stuff, but in a greater detail because it was a prepared speech. Brilliant, and if you needed a refresher, you can go watch that one as well. It was about the curses of economic nationalism. Brilliant man. I wish I could have interviewed him. That's how I feel coming
we can do it. We can get him on again,
episode.
maybe. That's the Lincoln Lie. It's not that long ago. Look on the channel and you'll see it. I also linked it in the show description. So really recommended. Thanks, Mickey.
Yes.
No Guard E says, this stream is bringing a lot of clarity to why many of the Confederate soldiers' statues were erected in the early 1900s. Yeah, so that's an interesting bit of history, right? Which is that you think that these Confederate statues they're going after now were erected like right after the war or something. But no, it was actually quite a bit later. And he goes on, disrespected bodies plus decades of foreign occupation results in, once the occupation has subsided, raise statues to those who died trying to prevent that.
Yeah, and that's all they got as well. Like most of those generals, most of those soldiers, and a lot of the statues being erected were usually of the Confederate soldier, like the average Joe that died and whose name is now known only to God. That's who most of the statues were erected for. That's all they got. And that was torn down in the last summer, 2 summers ago, rather.
Okay, and then we have a number of super chats. All right, Red Dragon 412. I demand a rendition of Johnny Appleseed Turnip Style. That's good. Is Johnny Appleseed an old song? I just remember like the legend of Johnny Appleseed, but there's an actual song.
Yeah, there's a folk song about it.
Jedi Knight, Anakin Cringewalker. I looked into the Void, and the Void had a bow tie. Yeah, I had read that earlier. Prince of Parma. Extremely depressing, but the truth must be told. Secular saints must be dismantled. Fortifications of the past pointed out, and idols relinquished. Yeah, that is my view. My view is I just don't care. All lost causes are still live for me personally. Because if you don't do that, then what just happened last year is considered a lost cause, right? Like nothing is remembered. Everything is lost. You just give up every time. And that's not the road I want to follow.
Yeah, they're not lost. They're just temporarily suppressed. Like they aren't going to no country is infinite, and the current republic certainly isn't. It's probably on its last legs. Those ideas aren't going to go away when the republic goes away. They've instilled like a national folk spirit into the South that you're going to have to take a long time to root it out of there if that's what's going to happen.
Okay, now this next one from Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker, I think I saw when it came through, so to give us some context, I think he's talking about the vindictive policy towards the South. And he says, what degree was this government policy versus popular will vengeance due to so many dead sons? That is, was the North supporting the radical Republicans because they were mad about the war, you know? Well, the first thought that came to mind, and I should have stats to back this up, but as we know, didn't focus on this today, but there were a lot of Union soldiers who were not American in the sense we'd usually think of it. They were recent immigrants from Germany and so forth. Right.
Ireland.
They got them off the boat and they put them into the army, you know? And so, you know, you're picturing that you've got these long-standing North Americans who are just angry that the South caused all this trouble, right? Well, yes, there were some of those, but there were also a bunch of other people involved with the Union side. But anyway, that's not a full response. Any thoughts real quick on that one?
Yeah, so think about this. The vindictive policy was mostly at the hands of the army, and they weren't just going into the South and occupying it scot-free. They were still getting shot at. People were still dying in the army. If I'm a northerner and I lost someone, and I'm going to vote for the radicals, what I'm doing is I am putting someone else into the military, maybe another son of mine or something like that, to go down to the South and get shot at for the war that I didn't like already because my other son got
Right.
shot at and died. Like it's like that's the one sense, and the other sense is that most people in the North did not care about the South. They cared about the economic policy because that's
Right.
what impacted them. The South did not impact people in the
Mm-hmm.
North directly. And that's why the Peace Democrats were such a big threat to Lincoln during the war. It's because even then, it was just an unpopular cause in the North. Like if I'm some laborer in Pennsylvania, what do I care if Alabama is not part of the same country that I'm in? Like the people were voting for the radicals, at least most logically, for what their interests were, and the radicals were promising the people in the North all these policies that just benefited them at the expense of other people they didn't care about. So, like that's why I mentioned that earlier. It's because that's why they got
Mm-hmm.
elected still.
Sam153, I'm definitely learning a lot. Cheers. Thanks, Sam. And one more from Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker. This makes me think the United States, is Rome's timeline if Pompey beat Caesar and the Senate won. I don't know my Roman history well
Right.
enough to
Yeah. And
speak learnedly on that parallel. I almost follow. Do you have any thoughts on it?
uh, well, I vaguely know what it is, and I'm not going to speak to great detail because I know if I do, I'm going to get 40 ats in Discord in 5 minutes saying that I was wrong about
Right.
this, and this detail. But we had an opportunity, had Lincoln not been shot, to have an actual, for better or worse, an actual Caesar. Like he was seizing all the power that all the other branches of government
Yeah.
were having. He was
Yeah.
acting as a dictator. The army thought he was great and all this other stuff. He was the time to have a Caesar. He was shot, so the Senate, quite literally in
Yeah.
this case, took over.
Right.
That's just what
That's
happened.
the way to put it.
So it's not too
Okay.
far
Well,
off.
thank you, Ryan Turnipseed, for joining us. I've been so excited to share your real name with everybody. I just was like, is this real? Am I in a dream? Is this really happening? It's just so fun.
It is
so
very
fun.
much reality.
And we will be back. Let's see. Next week is Econ Minis. Some shorter topics, more current event topics, I expect. Lumber prices are down. They're not so high anymore. I just saw that update. We'll see what else we have to talk about. And please support the show on Subscribestar, trying to step it up. I hope you appreciate the beautiful slides and the production, and we're going to just keep making the show better. And I hope that you all enjoy it. All right. Thanks, Ryan, and goodbye, everybody.